Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story. I didn't call the police when I saw him sitting outside my window, and that decision still haunts me. I didn't call the police when I saw him sitting outside my window, and that decision is the reason I still don't feel completely safe in my own home. At the time, nothing about the night felt unusual. It was one of those quiet weekday nights where everything slows down after midnight. The kind of silence that almost feels earned. I had just come home from work, kicked my shoes off by the door, and let the familiar sounds of the house settle around me. The low hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of the air conditioner turning on and off, the faint buzzing of the streetlight outside bleeding through the curtains. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt to finally be alone. I turned the TV on, more for the noise than anything else. The glow from the screen washed over the living room, leaving the corners of the house in shadow. Outside, the wind nudged the fence in the backyard, producing a dull creak every few minutes. It was comforting, predictable. I stayed on the couch longer than I should have, half watching whatever was on, half dozing. When I finally went to bed, the house felt heavier somehow, quieter than before. The kind of quiet where every small sound feels amplified. I lay there listening to the ticking of the clock on my nightstand, the fabric of the sheets shifting as I moved. My breathing slowly evened out. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was the faint scrape of plastic against concrete, short-controlled, deliberate, like someone dragging a chair just a few inches at a time. My eyes opened immediately. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to repeat. Nothing. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe the wind. That explanation should have been enough. I'd used it 100 times before, but my body didn't relax. My heart kept beating faster, louder, like it knew something my brain didn't want to accept. Then I heard a whistle. Not a tune, not playful. Just one long, thin note cutting through the silence outside my bedroom window. I sat up slowly, every muscle tense. The air in the room felt colder, thicker. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't reach for my phone. I just listened. A few seconds passed, then another whistle. Closer this time. I remember the exact moment I stood up and pulled the curtain back just enough to look outside. I expected to see nothing. I needed to see nothing. Instead, under the dim glow of the backyard security light, there was a man sitting in one of my chairs. He wasn't moving. He wasn't looking around. His head was tilted slightly upward, as if he already knew exactly where my window was. I stepped back from the glass, my hands shaking. And still, I didn't call the police, because somehow, in that moment, I convinced myself that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't react, he might just get bored and leave. I was wrong. I was 32 when it happened, and that detail matters only because people love to tell you what you should be afraid of at 32 bills. Blood pressure, layoffs, the future. Not shadows. Not the sound of a chair scraping concrete in the middle of the night. Back then, my life was simple, in a way that felt earned. I worked evenings, at a small logistics warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like cardboard dust and diesel exhaust and stale coffee that had been reheated too many times. We handled freight for a handful of local businesses, pallets of paper goods, boxes of medical supplies, bulk shipments of who knows what that arrived, shrink-wrapped like they were trying to hide their own existence. I wasn't a manager, wasn't climbing any ladder. I was a dependable body with a badge and a routine. My shift started late afternoon and ran into the night, and there was something about that schedule that kept me steady. People think night work makes you strange, but the truth is, it makes you predictable. The world narrows down to tasks and timers and the comfort of repetition. That night, I clocked out at 11:30 p.m. on the dot. I remember because the time clock always lagged by a minute, and I'd gotten into the habit of watching it like it was trying to steal my life in 60-second increments. The punch machine gave its little plastic chunk noise, my badge beeped, and the fluorescent lights above me made everything look faintly sick. Even the white walls looked tired. Outside the parking lot had the drained, forgotten feel of a place that had already been abandoned for hours. A few cars sat spaced out like they didn't trust each other. The warehouse sign, mounted on an aluminum pole near the entrance, buzzed with that lazy neon hum, the kind you don't hear until you're alone enough to notice it. The light flickered once as I passed beneath it, not out completely, just a brief stutter that made the shadows jump. I remember thinking, great. Another thing they won't fix. I walked to my car with my keys threaded between my fingers without really meaning to. It wasn't even fear. It was muscle memory, something my mom had drilled into me when I first started driving. I unlocked the car, climbed in, and shut the door with the heavy ceiling thud that made the outside world feel farther away. When I started the engine, the heater came on with a dry, cough-blowing air that still smelled faintly like the warehouse on my jacket dust and pallet wood and industrial cleaner. The drive home took about 15 minutes depending on how many lights I hit. Most nights, I didn't pass more than a handful of cars. The town I lived in wasn't small. Small, but at that hour, it felt like a model someone had built and then forgotten to play with. Storefronts were dark. Gas station canopies glowed in the distance like quiet beacons. The roads were clean, wide, and empty, and the emptiness had a calming effect, as if the world had decided to leave me alone. My girlfriend Jenna was an RN. Her schedule never made sense to anyone who didn't live inside it. Some weeks, she was home at 5 in the afternoon. Others, she was gone until morning. And that night, she was on an overnight shift. We'd talked earlier in the day, the way people do when they're busy and tired, quick, practical, affectionate, in shorthand. She'd told me to eat something that wasn't vending machine trash. I'd promised I would. I didn't. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was how quiet my street was. It was a cul-de-sac, tucked behind an older strip mall that had seen better decades. There were a few houses, a couple of rentals like mine, and lots of trees. The street light at the corner had a faint buzzing sound you could hear when the wind died down. My neighbors, mostly older couples, kept their porch lights off after 10. They believed, I guess, in darkness as a form of rest. My house was a single-story rental with a small backyard and a sliding glass door that opened onto a concrete patio. It wasn't charming, but it was practical. The kind of place that looked exactly like what it was, a temporary stage set for an adult life in progress. There was a narrow front entry that opened into a living room, a short hallway to the bedroom and bathroom, and a kitchen off to the side with a small dining nook that never got used for actual dining. I liked it because I could see most of it from almost anywhere. That mattered more to me than I would have admitted. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled tiny metallic clicks, like the car was settling its bones. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and stopped. The air outside had that Midwest late-night coolness, not freezing, but sharp enough to make you breathe a little deeper. As I stepped out, my shoes made a soft crunch on the gravel near the driveway edge. The wind pushed through the trees and brushed the fence in the backyard. It wasn't loud, just a faint rubbing sound, wood against wood, the kind of noise you stop noticing until you're standing alone in the dark and your brain starts drawing outlines around it. I locked my car. I remember the chirp. I remember the quick flash of the headlights. I remember thinking, home. Inside the house greeted me with its familiar harmless noises. The refrigerator hummed steadily, a low mechanical purr. The air conditioner clicked on, then off, then on again, like it couldn't decide how hard it wanted to work. Somewhere in the walls, a faint pipe pinged cooling after the last person had used the hot water, which should have been me earlier, but I'd showered before work. That was one of my little rituals, shower, clean clothes, leave. Like I could rinse the day off before it started. I tossed my keys into the bowl by the door. The metal clink echoed a little more than it should have. I hung my jacket on the back of the chair by the kitchen table. The chair squeaked softly under the shifting weight of fabric, and for a second, the sound made me pause. Just a pause, the kind you barely register. It wasn't fear yet, more like attention. I flipped on the lamp in the living room, the one with the beige shade Jenna hated. Its light was warm and weak, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. My TV sat against the opposite wall, black and reflective, waiting. I didn't feel like scrolling through my phone, didn't feel like hearing my own thoughts. So I turned the TV on for company, letting the low dialogue and canned laughter wash through the room like white noise. And slowly, the night became ordinary. I reheated leftovers I didn't really want, ate, standing at the counter, and listened to the house breathe around me. The refrigerator's hum rose and fell. The floor creaked once near the hallway. The air vent in the ceiling exhaled a steady stream of cool air with a soft, constant rush. Outside, beyond the sliding glass door, the backyard was a dark square. The patio was a paler rectangle. The fence line was just a suggestion. At one point, I noticed the faint glow of the backyard security light, one of those motion-activated floodlights mounted under the eave near the patio door. It was on. That wasn't unusual. Not completely. It sometimes picked up stray cats, wind-blown branches, a raccoon if one got brave. But I stood there, with a fork in my hand, staring at that dull glow, bleeding through the blinds, trying to remember if I'd triggered it myself. I couldn't. I shrugged it off, because that's what adults do when something doesn't fit neatly into their mental picture of the night. We make room for it. We file it under probably nothing. We keep moving. If I could go back to that moment, standing there in the half light, listening to the refrigerator and the air conditioner and my own chewing, I think I'd do one thing differently. I think I would have looked out the window longer than a second. But I didn't. I finished eating. I rinsed my plate. I turned down the volume on the TV. And as the night settled deeper around the house, I let myself believe I was alone in it. The routine made me feel safe. And I didn't realize yet that safety can be the most convincing lie a quiet house ever tells you. The front door always stuck a little in the winter, even when it wasn't technically winter. The frame had shifted over the years, swelling and shrinking with humidity, like the house was breathing. That night, I leaned my shoulder into it and felt it give with a familiar resistance before it clicked shut behind me. I remember thinking I locked it. That's the part that bothers me now, how automatic everything was. How much of my life I did on autopilot. Keys in hand, deadbolt turn chain slide. That was the sequence in my head. Muscle memory. The kind of thing you do while your mind is already halfway inside the next room. I even heard what I believed was the little metal snick of the lock settling into place. But I didn't stop to test the knob afterward. I stepped into the entryway and let the warmth of the house wrap around me. It wasn't cozy in a movie sense. No fireplace, no soft music, but it had that basic lived-in warmth that comes from a working heater and an environment you've repeated enough nights in a row to stop noticing the edges. The air smelled faintly like laundry detergent and the lemon cleaner Jenna liked, even though Jenna wasn't there. That smell was one of the tiny ways she still lived in my space, like a handprint on a window you can't quite wipe away. The entry opened into the living room, and the living room was exactly how I'd left it that morning. Couch facing the TV throw blanket wadded in the corner, a stack of mail on the coffee table that I kept swearing I'd sort through. The carpet was that neutral rental beige that never really looked clean even when it was. The kind of texture that grabbed the soles of your socks and made a soft shh sound when you walked across it. The house was quiet, but not silent. There's a difference. The refrigerator in the kitchen was cycling through its routine compressor, kicking on with a low, steady hum, then falling back to a softer purr. The air conditioner clicked once like a fingertip tapping glass. Then the vent over the hallway let out a gentle rush of cool air. Somewhere inside the walls, something popped old wood settling pipes, cooling the ordinary noises of a structure reminding you it exists. I'd lived there long enough to recognize most of those sounds, the way you recognize a friend's footsteps. I tossed my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, and the sound echoed a beat longer than I expected. The bowl was too empty. The ring of metal felt sharp in the quiet, like it had cut into the night. I caught myself listening afterward, waiting for a second sound that didn't come. That was my first little habit, always listening for the follow-up noise, the confirmation that the world was still predictable. I kicked my shoes off and walked to the kitchen without turning on the overhead lights. I didn't like the bright ceiling lights. They made everything look harsh and temporary. Instead, I clicked on the small lamp in the corner of the living room, the one with the beige shade and the thin brass neck. It cast a dim circle of warm light that didn't quite reach the hallway, leaving the far end of the house in soft darkness. That darkness didn't bother me, at least, not then. I turned on the TV because I'd gotten used to filling empty space with noise. Jenna hated falling asleep. To TV audio said it made her dreams weird. But when she was on overnight shifts, the house felt too still, without something talking in the background. Silence gives your mind room to wander. Noise keeps it politely occupied. The screen lit up in that familiar cold blue glow, washing over the living room like moonlight that had learned how to come from a box. It reflected faintly in the blank black glass of the window, It made the hallway look deeper than it was. It made the corners of the room look like they were holding their breath. I didn't choose anything special. Some forgettable streaming show, people arguing in kitchens, laugh tracks, bright colors that didn't belong in my dim living room. My eyes slid over the scenes while my brain drifted. The couch fabric was rough under my fingertips, one of those cheap weaves that always felt a little scratchy. I pulled the throw blanket over my legs, feeling its worn softness, and settled into the groove of the cushion where my body had shaped it. That groove made me feel safe. There's a kind of comfort that comes from evidence you've been here before, evidence you've survived other nights alone. The familiar sag of the couch, the faint dent in the carpet where your coffee table legs always sat, the little scuff mark on the baseboard near the hallway that you've promised yourself you'll clean but never do. Those details tell you the story of your own normal life. And I was hungry in that dull post-shift way that didn't feel like hunger in the stomach, more like a tiredness in the bones that only food can fix. I walked to the microwave and opened it. The door squeaked softly, a high, brief sound, and the interior light came on, bright and clinical. I put a plastic container of leftover pasta inside. When I hit the button, the microwave started with that low mechanical hum, and the steady rotation you could feel more than hear. The sound layered itself over the TV dialogue. For a moment, everything blended into a kind of domestic noise soup microwave, humming, TV, murmuring refrigerator, cycling the faint rush of air from the vent. The normal life soundtrack. While the food heated, I stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard through the blinds above it. The blinds were closed, but not perfectly. They never are. One slat always tilts slightly wrong, leaving a thin line of visibility. Outside was mostly black. The patio was a faint, pale shape. The fence was an even darker rectangle beyond that. If a person stood out there in that darkness, they would be just another shadow among shadows. I didn't think about that. Not consciously. The microwave beeped. 3 sharp beeps that felt too loud in the quiet house. I flinched more than I should have, and then laughed quietly at myself, a small exhale through my nose. Relax, I told myself. You're not a kid. I ate at the counter, half watching the TV. The pasta tasted like nothing. I chewed mechanically. My eyes kept drifting to the glow of the TV screen, and then away again. The living room lamp created a calm little island of light, and beyond it, the rest of the house faded into shadow like it didn't exist. That's what my house did at night. It shrank. It became just the rooms I could see, just the surfaces the light touched. The hallway was a tunnel of dimness. The bedroom door was a darker rectangle. The bathroom door even darker. But none of it felt threatening. It was simply empty space. At some point, I got up to throw the container in the trash and noticed something that should have been too minor to matter. The back patio light was on. Not the tiny porch light by the sliding door, the bigger one. The motion-activated floodlight mounted under the eave that usually stayed off unless something moved outside. It threw a pale wedge of light across the patio bright enough that it made the blinds glow faintly from the other side. I stood still, fork in my hand, staring at the blinds. My first thought was a cat. My second thought was wind. My third thought, uninvited and quickly dismissed, was someone out there. But my mind didn't like that third thought. It pushed it away and replaced it with something easier. Maybe it's just stuck on. I'd seen it do that once before. The sensor was old and finicky. Sometimes a moth could trigger it. Sometimes it would stay on for a full minute and then shut off like nothing happened. I told myself it was nothing. And because I wanted it to be nothing, I let it be nothing. Still, I found myself walking toward the sliding door. I didn't open it. I didn't pull the blinds aside. I just stood there close enough to feel the cold radiating through the glass and listened. The house noises continued. Refrigerator hum, TV dialogue, the faint, steady breath of the vent. Outside, there was only the wind brushing the fence. No footsteps, no voices, no scraping. I felt a tiny, ridiculous relief, like I'd passed a test I hadn't studied for. I stepped back from the door and returned to the couch, telling myself I was being stupid. Telling myself the world wasn't a horror movie. Telling myself the patio light was just a patio light. I watched another 10 minutes of the show without absorbing a single plot point. The blue glow of the TV softened the room. My eyelids grew heavy. My body sank deeper into the couch groove. The warmth of the blanket made me feel drowsy, and the constant background noises worked like a lullaby. And that's the part I keep returning to now, over and over, the moment my brain decided I was safe. Because when you live alone, you learn to trust your routines. You learn to trust the lock. You think you turned the light. You think you shut off the world. You think you understand. That night, inside the house, nothing felt wrong. And maybe that was the real warning. Not the patio light. Not the quiet. Not even the way the shadows seemed to hold their shape a little too well. The warning was how easily I let myself relax. How easily I let myself believe that whatever was outside would stay outside. I don't remember deciding to go to bed. I remember realizing I was already standing in the hallway, the TV still murmuring behind me, the light from the living room lamp stretching across the carpet like it was reluctant to let me go. That's how tired I was, moving on instinct, letting routine carry me the rest of the way. I shut the TV off without really looking at it. The sudden absence of sound felt heavier than the noise had. The house didn't become silent so much as it revealed itself. The refrigerator hummed on its own schedule. The air conditioner exhaled once, then went quiet. The darkness pressed closer, reshaping familiar spaces into simpler outlines. Doorways became rectangles. Corners became suggestions. I brushed my teeth in the bathroom with the light on, staring at my reflection longer than usual. My eyes looked dull, unfocused, like they belonged to someone who had been awake too long. I told myself I'd shower in the morning. I told myself a lot of small things that night, all of them reasonable, all of them designed to move me forward without thinking too much. When I turned the bathroom light off, the hallway swallowed me. I walked into the bedroom and shut the door, most of the way, not closed, not open, just how I always left it. The bedroom window faced the backyard, but the blinds were drawn, and the faint glow of the patio light leaked around the edges like a dim halo. I didn't question why it was still on. I didn't need to. My brain had already decided it was irrelevant. I lay down on the bed, the mattress dipping under my weight, the familiar creak of the frame sounding off beneath me. The sheets were cool. I shifted once, then again, until my body found its place. Somewhere in the house, a pipe clicked softly as the temperature changed. I listened to it without thinking the way you listen to rain against a roof. Sleep came in pieces. I drifted in and out, that shallow kind of sleep where you're not fully unconscious, where thoughts slide around without forming complete sentences. Images surfaced and faded work the drive home, the glow of the TV. At some point, I rolled onto my side and pulled the blanket higher, my body reacting to a chill I couldn't quite place. Then I woke up. There was no dream snapping me awake, no sudden jolt of fear. My eyes opened calmly, as if I'd simply decided it was time. For a few seconds, I lay there staring into the dark, listening to my own breathing, trying to figure out why I wasn't asleep anymore. That's when I heard it. The sound was so light I almost missed it. A brief, delicate scrape like metal brushing against metal, then stopping. Not a crash. Not a knock. Just enough noise to register as wrong without offering any clues as to what it was. I held my breath, without realizing it, every muscle in my body suddenly aware of its own existence. The darkness felt closer, heavier, like it had weight now. I waited for the sound to repeat. It didn't. My heart beat once hard, then settled into a faster rhythm. I listened for footsteps, for voices, for anything that would give the sound a shape. All I heard was the house still doing what houses do. The refrigerator kicked on again, its hum filling the silence. The air vent whispered softly as cool air crept into the room. Somewhere in the walls, wood shifted with a faint, tired groan. I told myself it was the house settling. That explanation slid into place easily, like it had been waiting. Old houses make noise, temperature changes, pipes contract, metal expands and shrinks. I'd heard all of it before. I'd woken up to it before. There was nothing unusual about being startled awake by a sound you couldn't immediately identify. Except I was fully awake now. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the vague shape of the ceiling, replaying the sound in my head. It had been too controlled for something breaking, too brief for something falling, almost intentional. That thought made my chest tighten, and I pushed it away as quickly as it had arrived. You're tired, I told myself. That's all. I shifted in bed, the sheets, whispering softly as I moved. The sound felt too loud in the quiet room, and I froze again, listening to the echo of my own movement fade. Nothing followed it. No reaction, no response from the darkness. The rational part of my brain took over, laying out explanations like evidence on a table. The wind had been picking up earlier. It could have nudged something against the fence. The patio furniture might have shifted slightly on the concrete. The metal latch on the gate sometimes rattled when the temperature dropped at night. Any one of those could have produced a sound like the one I heard. I almost convinced myself. I rolled onto my back and exhaled slowly, forcing my muscles to relax. My eyelids felt heavy again, the edges of sleep creeping back in. The house noises blended together, forming that low, constant backdrop I was used to. My heart rate slowed. My thoughts lost their sharpness. Just as I was about to drift off again, it happened. A sound cut through everything else, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. A whistle. One single note, soft and thin, floating in from outside the bedroom window. It wasn't playful. It wasn't musical. It didn't rise or fall. It was just a steady sound, held for a second longer than felt natural, then released back into the night. My eyes snapped open. Every explanation I'd carefully stacked in my head collapsed at once. Houses don't whistle. Pipes don't whistle like that. Wind doesn't choose a single note and hold it precise and deliberate right outside a bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there listening, my pulse pounding in my ears, waiting to hear it again or to hear something worse. Nothing came. The whistle didn't repeat. The night returned to its quiet routine. The refrigerator hummed. The air conditioner clicked on and off. The darkness stayed where it was, unmoving and patient. Eventually, against my better judgment, my body relaxed. Fatigue won out over fear. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself I'd fallen halfway into a dream and pulled the sound out with me. At the time, I believed that explanation. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Looking back, it was already too late. The whistle didn't come again, at least not right away. For a long moment, the night folded back into itself, as if nothing had happened. I lay there in the dark, with my eyes open, listening to the familiar mechanical rhythms of the house refrigerator hum the soft rush of air through the vent, the faint ticking of the clock on my nightstand. I wanted those sounds to drown everything else out. I wanted them to be proof that the world was still normal. But my body wasn't cooperating with my logic. My mouth was dry. My hands felt too warm under the blanket. My heartbeat had moved from my chest into my throat, a steady, heavy thump that made it hard to tell whether the silence outside was real or just something I couldn't hear over myself. I tried to reason it out the way I always did when my mind drifted toward the darker explanations. A neighbor's kid messing around, maybe. Someone walking their dog and whistling without realizing how far sound carries at night. A car radio. Wind slipping through a gap in the fence and making something sing. There were a dozen boring answers, and I held on to them because boring is safe. Still, I couldn't roll over and go back to sleep. The part of me that wanted certainty, even if certainty came with fear, started pushing forward. If I checked and there was nothing, I could laugh at myself in the morning. If I checked and there was something, then at least I'd know. At least I wouldn't be lying in the dark, imagining the worst. I slipped my hand out from under the blanket and reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up instantly, a cold rectangle of white that felt too bright in the darkness. I turned it face down right away, as if the light itself had betrayed me. My heart kicked harder. I stared at the silhouette of the phone, suddenly afraid of my own movement. I waited, listening again. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No scraping. Just the low household hum and the quiet pressure of the night outside the window. I sat up slowly, the mattress whispering under my weight. The springs made a faint creak that sounded loud enough to echo down the hallway. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for a response from outside, some shift in the dark, some sign that someone had heard me. There was none. That almost made it worse. I slid out of bed and stood barefoot on the cool floor, feeling the chill creep up into my ankles. The bedroom was a deeper shade of darkness than the rest of the house, but the faint glow around the blinds still suggested that the patio light was on. It leaked in at the edges, like a weak, persistent halo. I hadn't noticed it earlier as anything but a minor inconvenience. Now it felt like a stage light, waiting for something to step into view. I took one step toward the window, then stopped. Something in my brain told me not to rush, not to make sudden movements, not to reveal myself quickly. It was the same instinct that makes you pause before turning a corner in a dark hallway. The feeling that if you move too confidently, you're inviting something to prove you wrong. So I moved carefully, quietly, like I was walking through someone else's house. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to cast my silhouette onto the blinds. I didn't want to announce my exact location. I approached the window from the side, keeping my body close to the wall, my shoulder brushing the cool paint. I could hear my own breathing, slow and shallow. I could hear my heartbeat even louder now, a steady pounding that felt embarrassing, like my body was making too much noise. When I reached the window, I hovered there for a second, staring at the blinds. The blinds were closed, but there was that slight imperfection, the slat that never sat quite right, leaving a narrow gap if you angled your head just enough. I leaned in slowly. My fingertips touched the cord, but I didn't pull it. I didn't want the blinds to rattle. The sound of plastic clacking together would have felt like shouting. Instead, I lifted one slat with the tip of my finger. The movement was so small, it barely changed the room's light. A thin blade of brightness from outside slipped in, painting a narrow line across my knuckle. I held it there and looked out through the gap. At first, I saw only the patio. The concrete was pale under the motion-activated floodlight, dotted with tiny dark specks, leaves, dirt, whatever the wind had carried in. The fence stood beyond it, a tall wall of wood that blocked most of the world. The yard itself was a patch of uneven grass, darker at the edges where the light didn't reach. And then my eyes adjusted and I saw the chair. It was one of those cheap plastic patio chairs, white, slightly stained from weather, and used the kind you can buy at Walmart and never feel guilty about leaving outside. I kept 2 of them out there, mostly because Jenna liked sitting on the patio when she was off shift, holding a cup of coffee, like she was trying to convince herself she wasn't always exhausted. I rarely used them myself. One of them was closer to the window than it should have been. It wasn't right against the glass, but it was positioned in a way that felt deliberate, turned slightly angled, just enough that whoever sat in it would have a clear view of the house. Someone was sitting in it. At first glance, my brain tried to reduce him to a shadow, a dark shape, nothing more. But the longer I looked, the more details sharpened into something undeniable. Broad shoulders, a head with dark hair, or maybe a hat I couldn't tell under the harsh light. Arms resting low, loose, as if he had all the time in the world. He was facing away from me, but his posture was wrong. His head wasn't level. It was tilted slightly upward, just enough to suggest he wasn't looking at the fence or the yard or the sky. He was looking toward the house, toward my window, toward the exact place my face was hovering behind the blinds. I felt my stomach drop. That cold, sudden plunge you get when you miss a step in the dark. My mouth went dry. My hand tightened on the blind slat without me meaning to, bending it slightly. The chair didn't creak. He didn't shift. He didn't move his head. He was perfectly still. That stillness didn't feel like calm. It felt like patience. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would give me away. The sound filled my ears, drowning out the refrigerator, the air vent, everything. I pressed my lips together, trying to quiet my breathing. The air in my lungs felt sharp and thin, like I couldn't inhale without making noise. Somewhere in the backyard, the wind nudged the chimes hanging near the patio door. They were cheap metal tubes, strung together, more decorative than musical. In the daytime, you barely noticed them. At night, in that moment, their tiny movements sounded impossibly loud. They gave a faint, delicate clink, one tube brushing another, and then went still again. The sound made my nerves spike. Not because it was scary on its own, but because it proved the air was moving. It proved the night was alive. It proved that if I could hear, that he could hear things too. I didn't know how long I stared at him. It could have been 5 seconds. It could have been 30. Time stretched thin when my brain couldn't decide what it was looking at. All I knew was that I felt frozen in place, caught between disbelief and certainty. Part of me wanted to yank the blinds closed and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Another part of me wanted to fling the door open and scream at him to break the spell of his silence. But I didn't do either. I did the one thing that felt instinctively safe. I eased the blind slat back down and stepped away from the window as quietly as I could. I backed up until my shoulder hit the wall. Then I turned and moved toward the bedroom door, my bare feet making almost no sound on the floor. In my mind, I kept repeating the same thought like a prayer. Don't move. Don't make noise. Don't let him know you saw him. And the worst part was, even as I told myself that even as my body tried to disappear into the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that he already knew. I didn't shut the bedroom door all the way. I eased it until it was almost closed, leaving the smallest crack, just enough that I could see the sliver of hallway beyond, just enough that I could hear if something changed in the house. The instinct felt childish, like I was trying to hide from a storm by pulling a blanket over my head. But I wasn't thinking in adult terms anymore. I was thinking in survival terms. Quiet, still, invisible. I crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside the bed, putting the mattress between me and the window. The carpet was cool against my palms. I could smell the detergent in the sheets and the faint, stale warmth of the room, that mix of clean fabric and old air. My phone was still on the nightstand face down, like a guilty secret. I stared at it, knowing it was the fastest way to turn this into something official, something real. Because the second you call the police, you're saying it out loud. There is a man outside my house, and I'm afraid. And that was the part I couldn't bring myself to do yet. I tried to convince myself there was still a normal explanation. Someone drunk wandering into the wrong yard. A neighbor's friend waiting for an Uber. A guy cutting through backyards because he didn't want to walk along the street. My mind reached for any story that didn't end with the one my body already believed. But every explanation fell apart under one simple detail: the chair. He wasn't standing. He wasn't moving. He wasn't lost. He had chosen one of my chairs in my backyard and positioned himself like he belonged there. People don't do that by accident. They don't sit down and settle in unless they mean to stay. My heart beat harder as I pictured him out there, still angled toward the house, still looking up. I wondered if he could see the faint glow around the blinds, if he could make out my shape when I stepped near the window, if he knew exactly where the bedroom was. That thought made the back of my neck prickle. I held my breath and listened. The house offered its usual sounds like proof of sanity. The refrigerator compressor kicked on low and steady. The air conditioner clicked, then the vent exhaled with a soft rush. In the distance beyond the fence, I could just barely hear the highway, a constant far-off hiss that made the world feel bigger than the small circle of my home. Somewhere outside, a branch tapped the fence, a hollow knock, then stopped. No footsteps, no voice, no movement in the yard. The calm stretched long enough that a part of me began to hope I had imagined the man. That maybe I'd seen a chair with a jacket thrown over it, the floodlight playing tricks on my eyes. That maybe my brain had taken the whistle and built a monster out of it. I almost stood up to check again. Instead, I crawled toward the foot of the bed and carefully lifted the edge of the blanket, peering into the dark space underneath like I was searching for a missing sock. My mind was doing that desperate thing it does when it wants to regain control. Checking, scanning, inventing tasks. The space under the bed was empty, except for a couple of storage bins. No shadows moved. Nothing breathed. I let the blanket fall back into place. I stayed on the floor, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. The posture felt small. It felt humiliating. I told myself I was being stupid, that I was a grown man hiding in his own bedroom, like a kid during a thunderstorm. But I couldn't make myself move. I thought about Jenna. She was at the hospital, busy, exhausted, probably elbow deep in work. Calling her would do nothing except make her panic, and panic didn't protect anyone. I thought about my neighbors, older, asleep, their houses dark. I thought about the police. The police were the obvious answer, the adult answer, the responsible answer. And yet my thumb hovered over my phone without pressing anything. A voice in my head, the one that sounded like every sarcastic friend I'd ever had, kept whispering, "What if you're wrong? What if it's nothing? What if the police show up and it's just a cat and a motion light?" In my mind, I could see it, me standing there in boxers, trying to explain myself under the harsh beam of a flashlight, while a cop looked at me like I was wasting his time. I imagined the embarrassment crawling up my throat. I imagined the story becoming a joke, something I'd never hear the end of. That fear, the fear of looking dramatic, sounds ridiculous now. But in the moment, it had weight. It sat on my chest and kept my hand still. It made me hesitate. I told myself I would wait one more minute. If I heard anything else, I'd call. If the patio light turned off and stayed off, maybe he'd left. If I heard the gate, the fence footsteps, anything that confirmed a real threat, I'd call. I listened harder. The wind died down. The chimes stayed still. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. And then from the backyard, I heard it again. That same thin, controlled whistle. One long note held steady. Closer than before, or maybe it only felt closer, because now I knew what it meant. The sound slid through the glass and under the edges of the blinds and into my room like a needle. It wasn't loud, but it had intent. It had shape. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they want you to know they're there. I pressed my hand over my mouth without thinking, like I could physically stop my breathing from leaking out. My heartbeat pounded so hard, I thought it might shake the bed. Then the whistle stopped. A pause followed just long enough for me to realize I was trembling. And then a voice came through the window. Not shouted, not muffled, just calm, conversational, like he was standing beside me in the room. "I know you're awake." The words were simple, ordinary, but they landed like a weight on my chest. They didn't feel like a threat in the way threats are usually delivered. There was no anger in them, no urgency. That was what made them so horrifying. He wasn't trying to scare me into reacting. He wasn't trying to chase me away. He was stating a fact. He knew. My skin went cold. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I stared at the wall across from me, like it might give me instructions. I forced myself to breathe quietly through my nose, in and out, trying to keep the panic from spilling over into movement. Somewhere in the house, the refrigerator clicked off, and for a second, the silence became so complete, it felt like the world had stopped. In that silence, his words echoed again in my head, clearer than my own thoughts. "I know you're awake." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The story in my mind changed shape. It stopped being a weird noise, a finicky motion light, a tired imagination. It became a person outside my home, speaking to me through the dark. That was the first direct violation of safety. The first time the boundary between outside and inside cracked. And the worst part was what followed, what my body understood before my brain caught up. If he knew I was awake, then he had been watching long enough to be sure. After he spoke, the night didn't explode into chaos the way movies teach you to expect. There was no crash through glass, no sudden rush of footsteps, no pounding on the door. Instead, there was something far worse. Nothing happened. I stayed on the floor beside the bed, my back pressed into the frame, my knees drawn tight to my chest. My ears rang with the sound of my own heartbeat, each pulse loud and insistent, as if my body were trying to warn me that silence wasn't safety. I counted my breaths without meaning to. In through my nose, out through my mouth. Slow, quiet, controlled. From outside, I heard the chair move, not scraping violently, not dragged in frustration. It was the soft, deliberate sound of plastic shifting against concrete, just enough to tell me that he had stood up. The sound was careful, measured, like he was making sure not to announce himself any more than necessary. I pictured him rising from the chair, slowly stretching his legs after sitting too long. I imagined him looking at the house, the way someone looks at a puzzle they've already figured out, checking the pieces one last time. The thought made my stomach tighten. Footsteps followed. They weren't rushed. They didn't crunch loudly through the gravel or stomp across the patio. They were light-controlled, the kind of steps someone takes when they know exactly where they're going. I tracked the sound in my head as best I could, moving from the chair across the concrete toward the sliding glass door at the back of the house. I held my breath. The handle on the sliding door shifted, just slightly. There was no yank, no force. The metal made a soft, restrained sound as it was tested, turned gently, as if by someone checking whether it might open with minimal effort. My entire body tensed, waiting for the sharp crack of glass or the sudden rush of air that would follow a door being thrown open. It didn't come. The handle returned to its resting position. The door stayed closed. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stared at the dark space beneath the bed, as if something might crawl out of it and tell me what to do next. My hands were clenched so tightly my fingers ached. I didn't realize I was shaking until my teeth knocked together softly, a tiny sound that felt deafening in the quiet room. The footsteps moved away from the sliding door. They circled the house. I could tell by the pattern of sound, by the way it shifted from one side of the walls to another. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't wandering. He was moving with intention, mapping the exterior, learning the shape of the place the way you do when you're deciding how something works. When he reached the front of the house, I heard the faint creak of the porch step. Then the doorknob turned, again gently. The sound was unmistakable, the soft internal click of metal, the slight resistance as the lock held. He didn't rattle it. He didn't twist it hard. He applied just enough pressure to confirm what he already suspected. The door stayed shut. I felt a surge of relief that was immediately followed by something colder. He didn't react. No curse, no sigh, no frustrated movement. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He didn't test the door again. He simply let go. I waited for the sound of retreating footsteps, for the rhythm of someone walking away, disappointed, bored, moving on to some other house some other night. I told myself that was what people did. When they couldn't get in, they left. But the steps didn't retreat. They stopped, right outside the front door. The silence that followed was unbearable. It pressed in on me from all sides, thicker than the darkness. Even the house seemed to go still, as if it were listening too. The refrigerator didn't hum. The air conditioner didn't click. The faint highway noise felt impossibly far away. I realized I was holding my breath again, and forced myself to inhale slowly, quietly, terrified that even that small sound might give me away. My mind raced through options that all felt equally useless. Call the police, hide, run, scream. Each one rose and collapsed before I could act on it. Because through all of it, one truth was becoming painfully clear. He wasn't trying to get inside. Not yet. If he had wanted to force his way in, he could have tried harder. He could have shaken the door, tested the frame, made noise, applied pressure. He hadn't done any of that. Every movement had been restrained, precise, almost polite. The kind of behavior that suggested patience rather than urgency. And patience is terrifying. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time had lost its edges. I stared at the thin line of light under the bedroom door, half expecting to see a shadow slide across it. None came. The house remained sealed intact, but the feeling of violation didn't fade. It deepened. Then, just as quietly as it had begun, the presence outside shifted again. Footsteps moved away from the front door, slow and unhurried. I heard them cross the porch, then the patio. The chair scraped once more as he repositioned it, or maybe as he brushed past it. And then there was nothing. No whistle, no voice, no movement. Just the night settling back into place, like it hadn't been disturbed at all. I stayed where I was long after the sound stopped. My muscles burned from holding still. My throat was tight raw from breathing too shallowly. I didn't dare move toward the window. I didn't dare check the doors. I sat in the dark, listening for any sign that he was still there. Eventually, the refrigerator hummed back to life. The air conditioner sighed and pushed cool air through the vent. The house resumed its ordinary noises, offering them up like proof that everything was fine. But I knew better now. As the adrenaline began to ebb, something clicked into place in my mind, a realization that made my skin prickle even more than the voice at the window had. He hadn't been testing the doors. He'd been testing me. Every gentle turn of a handle, every pause in silence, every restrained movement had been a question. Will you react? Will you make noise? Will you reveal where you are? And when I hadn't, when I stayed quiet, frozen hidden, he learned something. He learned that I was afraid. And that somehow was exactly what he wanted. For a while, after the footsteps stopped, I stayed exactly where I was, on the floor, beside my bed, knees pulled to my chest, my body locked in the posture of someone trying to become smaller than the danger around him. The house had gone back to its normal sounds. The refrigerator, humming steadily again. The air vent, whispering cool air into the room. The faint tick of my clock finding its rhythm. Those noises were supposed to calm me. They were supposed to tell me the night had moved on. But my mind wouldn't follow. I kept replaying the voice at the window, the calm certainty of it. I know you're awake. The words had lodged in me like a splinter. Every time I blinked, I pictured the backyard chair under the floodlight, that wrong tilt of his head, the patience in his stillness. The absence of violence didn't make it better. It made it worse. It suggested control. It suggested he wasn't improvising. He was choosing every movement carefully. At some point, exhaustion began pressing against my fear, trying to pull me downward. My eyelids felt heavy. My muscles started to ache from being clenched for too long. I told myself that if I waited long enough, if I listened long enough, I would hear him leave. A gate squeak, footsteps fading down the street. Something. Anything that would let me put a period at the end of the sentence. Instead, the night stayed suspended. No confirmation. No closure. I finally forced myself to move slowly, like my body belonged to someone else. I crawled up onto the bed without letting the frame creak. I sat with my back against the headboard, staring toward the window, even though the blinds were closed. I kept my phone in my hand, now ready screen dark. I didn't even unlock it, just held it like a talisman. I told myself I would call if I heard one more sound, one more whistle, one more step, one more sign that he hadn't left. Minutes passed. I started to feel foolish again, and the shame mixed with fear in a way that made me angry at myself. You're letting this get to you, I thought. You saw a guy in your yard. People do weird things. He left. It's over. I tried to imagine telling Jenna about it in the morning, making it sound like a creepy but harmless encounter. I tried to picture myself laughing at how rattled I'd gotten. I tried to make the story smaller. Then the doorbell rang, just once. The sound punched through the house with a clean electronic chime that didn't belong in the quiet. It was loud enough to vibrate in my ribs. My entire body jolted as if the bell had been wired directly to my nerves. I froze, phone clenched in my fist, eyes wide in the darkness. For a second, I told myself it could be a neighbor, an emergency, someone at the wrong house. But it was nearly 1 in the morning. No one knocks on doors at 1 in the morning unless something is wrong. The bell didn't ring again. It just hung in the air and faded. I listened, straining so hard my ears hurt. I expected footsteps on the porch, a knock, the soft scuff of someone shifting their weight. There was nothing, no movement, no impatience. Whoever had rung the bell was standing perfectly still. That stillness was a message. I slid out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and moved toward the bedroom door. I kept my breathing shallow, trying to reduce every sound my body made. I eased the door open just enough to look into the hallway. The living room lamp was still on, casting a dim pool of warm light that made the rest of the house feel darker by comparison. The hallway was empty. The front of the house was a shadowed distance. I took one step into the hall and stopped. The air felt different out there, cooler, like the house had exhaled while I was trapped in my room. I moved forward again, slow, careful, the way you move in a place you know too well and suddenly don't trust. The carpet muffled my steps. Every creak of the floor felt like betrayal. When I reached the edge of the living room, I didn't go straight to the front door. I stayed behind the wall, using it as cover, peering around the corner, like I was in some stupid game I hadn't chosen to play. The TV was off, a black rectangle reflecting nothing. The windows were dark mirrors. I could see the front door from where I stood. The deadbolt was turned. The chain was latched. At least I thought it was. My brain flickered to the memory of walking in earlier, how automatic it had felt, how I hadn't tested the knob. A wave of cold discomfort rolled through me. Then a voice came from the other side of the door. Not loud, not muffled, not angry. Just calm, close. Like he was standing right there with his mouth near the wood, speaking in the same tone someone might use to tell you your delivery had arrived. You left your window unlocked. The words landed hard. My stomach turned as if I'd swallowed ice. For a moment, my mind refused to process what he had said. It tried to treat it like nonsense, like a random statement meant to confuse me. But the instant the sentence finished, a very specific detail flared to life in my memory, sharp and undeniable. The living room window latch. It stuck. It had always stuck. The window in the living room faced the front yard. It was an old sliding window with a cheap metal latch that didn't always catch unless you pushed the frame just right. In the summer, it would slide too easily and you had to slam it a little. In the winter, the track would tighten and the latch would sit a fraction of an inch off, like it couldn't commit. I'd complained about it to the landlord once. He'd said he'd take a look and never did. I'd learned to live with it, learned to press down until I felt the latch bite. But some nights, I didn't check it twice. Some nights, I was tired. Some nights, I assumed it was fine, and suddenly standing in my dark hallway with that man's voice on the other side of the door, I couldn't remember if I had checked it at all. My hand tightened around the phone so hard my knuckles ached. I wanted to call 911, wanted to press the buttons and hear a dispatcher's voice, wanted to bring another human being into this nightmare. But my fingers wouldn't cooperate. The shame was still there, faint, ridiculous, but it was being swallowed by something stronger. Now the dawning awareness that this wasn't about a random stranger wandering through the neighborhood. This was about my house, my routines, my mistakes. I took a step backward, away from the door, the movement slow and involuntary, like my body was trying to retreat from the sound of his voice. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, even through the wood. I imagined his face inches from the peephole, one eye, centered there, waiting for me to look back. I imagined his hand resting on the doorknob, not turning it, just touching it like a promise. I didn't answer him. The silence between us stretched thin and tense. I could hear my own pulse rushing in my ears. I could hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen, absurdly steady, as if the house didn't understand what was happening to it. The living room lamp buzzed faintly, a barely audible electrical whine. On the other side of the door, he breathed just once, audible enough that I knew it was deliberate, like he wanted me to know how close he was. Then, in the same calm voice, he added something that made the panic finally crack through my chest and spill into my limbs. "I don't want to wake your neighbors." A cold rush surged through me. My mouth went dry. My vision sharpened. The fear was no longer a vague dread. It was a hard, immediate panic with edges. Because that meant he had thought about the neighbors, which meant he had thought about the street, which meant he had thought about everything around my house the way you think about a place you've already studied. And as my mind latched onto the stuck window latch, the tiny flaw I'd ignored for months, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. He wasn't guessing. He was telling me what he already knew. I don't remember making a decision to run. I remember my body moving before my mind could catch up, like something ancient inside me had finally grabbed the steering wheel. 1 second, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the front door phone, clenched in my hand, trying to process the words, "You left your window unlocked." The next, I was backing away slow at first, then faster, retreating down the hall toward the only room in the house that had a lock on the inside, the bathroom. The floor changed under my feet as I moved soft carpet to cold tile. The tile felt like ice. I shut the bathroom door behind me as quietly as I could and turned the little thumb lock. The mechanism clicked with a thin, sharp sound that seemed to vibrate through the whole house. I winced, holding my breath, waiting for him to react. Nothing. No knock, no laugh, no voice. Just the refrigerator humming steadily in the kitchen, and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like a warning siren only I could hear. The bathroom was small, barely big enough for the tub, the toilet, and a narrow sink. the kind of rental bathroom where every surface is hard and echoing. I stood there in the dark because I didn't dare turn on the light. The glow under the door from the living room lamp was enough to outline the edges of the room, enough to let me see the shape of the sink, the mirror, the towel hanging on the rack. Enough to remind me I was trapped in a tiny box with nowhere to go. I held my phone in both hands and finally unlocked it, keeping the brightness as low as possible. The screen's pale light made my fingers look ghostly. I hovered over the keypad ready to dial, but my thumb wouldn't press the numbers yet. A stupid part of me still wanted one more piece of proof, one more unmistakable sound that told me I wasn't overreacting. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of movement from the living room. Not a bang, not a crash. More like the subtle shift of weight on carpet, the whisper of fabric brushing against something. It was so soft I almost convinced myself it was the house settling again. But I knew the rhythm of my house. I knew the difference between a pipe clicking and a person moving carefully. My throat tightened. I put the phone down on the edge of the sink so I wouldn't drop it, then pressed my ear closer to the door, trying to catch every detail. Footsteps. They were distant at first, muffled by carpet moving in slow, controlled intervals. Not the heavy tread of someone stomping through a house, not the hurried pace of someone searching in a panic. These steps had patience. They moved, paused, moved again, as if he were listening between each shift of his feet. My stomach turned as I realized what I was hearing. He was inside. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the thought away, trying to make it less real by refusing to picture it. But the sounds painted the image for me anyway. He wasn't at the front door anymore. He wasn't outside. He had found a way in through that stuck living room window, latched through some flaw I had ignored because it had been inconvenient rather than dangerous. The footsteps grew closer, and then the surface changed. Tile. A foot stepped onto the kitchen floor, and the sound was sharper now, more defined. A soft tap against hard tile, then another. The echo was faint, but it existed proof that he was no longer moving through the soft, forgiving spaces of my living room. The kitchen was an open area, and sound traveled there differently. It carried. It revealed. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep any noise from slipping out. The refrigerator door opened. The sound was unmistakable, the rubber seal pulling away a soft, suction-like release, then the muted clack as the door swung out. The compressor sound shifted, changing pitch, the hum suddenly louder as cold air spilled into the room. For a second, I imagined him standing there with the fridge light spilling over his hands, his face, his shoes. I imagined him calmly looking inside, like he belonged there, like he was deciding what he wanted. Then the fridge door closed again. Not slammed, not forced. Just closed, carefully, as if he didn't want to wake anyone. My breath came in shallow, shaky pulls. The bathroom seemed to shrink around me. I could smell the faint chemical scent of toilet cleaner and the soft sweetness of Jenna's shampoo. The familiar smell felt wrong in this context, like evidence of a life that was supposed to be normal, supposed to be safe. I reached for my phone again, my thumb finally ready to call when I heard the air conditioner click. It clicked off. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The AC cycled on and off all night, depending on temperature. But then something else happened that made my blood turn cold. It didn't click back on. The vent that had been whispering cool air into the house went silent. the steady background rush vanished. The subtle white noise that had been filling every room evaporated, leaving a vacuum behind it. The house became quieter than it had been at any point that night. And in that sudden absence of sound, every small noise became enormous. The creak of the bathroom door frame as I shifted my weight, the faint rustle of my shirt as I breathed, the soft tap of my fingernail against the phone screen when my hand trembled. It hit me then, sharp and sickening. He had turned it off. The AC unit's control panel was in the hallway near the kitchen. I knew that. I had walked past it 1,000 times. If he was inside and wanted the house quieter, all he had to do was flip the switch or press the button. A simple action, but it meant something terrifying. He wasn't just wandering. He was adjusting the environment. He was making the house the way he wanted it. Darkness became absolute in a way that didn't feel natural. The living room lamp was still on, but the air felt thicker without the vent's breath, like the house was holding its own oxygen. The silence sharpened my hearing until it almost hurt. I could hear my pulse. I could hear the faint buzz of electricity behind the bathroom wall. Then I heard footsteps again, closer. Tile tapping softly, one step at a time, moving down the hallway toward me. The pauses between the steps were longer now, as if he was listening for any sign of where I had gone. I pressed my back against the bathtub and lowered myself into a crouch, trying to make myself smaller, trying to make my breathing quieter. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. For a long moment, nothing happened. No knob turning, no knock, just stillness, as if the person on the other side was standing there with his head tilted, listening the way I had listened earlier. Then, so softly, it felt like it came through the crack under the door. Rather than through the air, a whisper reached me. I don't like when people hide. The words were not shouted. They were not angry. They were almost intimate, like a private confession meant only for me. And the quiet tone made the sentence more terrifying than if he had screamed it. Because it meant he wasn't trying to scare me into running. He was telling me he already understood exactly what I was doing. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, waiting for the lock to fail, waiting for the thin barrier between us to become meaningless. My hand hovered over my phone. My thumb was finally ready to press 911, but for one frozen second I couldn't move. All I could do was listen to the silence he had created and the way his presence filled it like poison. I don't remember exactly when I finally pressed the buttons. I remember my thumb hovering over the screen, shaking so badly I had to steady my hand against the sink. I remember the faint outline of the bathroom door in the dark, the knob perfectly still, as if nothing on the other side had ever been there. And I remember thinking absurdly that if I waited a few more seconds, maybe this would all resolve itself without me having to explain it to anyone. It didn't. When the dispatcher answered, her voice sounded impossibly normal, calm, professional. The kind of voice that belongs to a world where things make sense. I whispered, at first afraid the sound of my own voice would carry through the door. I told her there was someone in my house, or had been. I wasn't sure which sounded worse. She asked me questions where I was, whether I was hurt, whether the intruder was still inside, and I answered them in short clipped phrases, listening between each word for any movement outside the bathroom. By the time I hung up, the house had gone completely still. No footsteps, no voice, no sound of anyone leaving. That silence scared me more than the noises had. I stayed locked in the bathroom for what felt like hours, though I later learned it was less than 20 minutes. My legs cramped from crouching. My back ached from pressing against the tub. Every few seconds, my brain tried to convince me I was imagining things again, that the police would arrive and find nothing, that I would be standing there in the dark, looking ridiculous. Eventually, red and blue light spilled through the living room windows, cutting through the blinds in sharp, flashing stripes. I heard car doors open. Voices outside, real voices this time, layered and overlapping. Authority, presence, the sound of other people arriving in my world. I unlocked the bathroom door with trembling fingers and stepped into the hallway. The living room looked different under the strobing lights, unreal, like a place I'd seen before, but never actually been in. When I opened the front door, 2 officers stood on my porch hands, resting near their belts, eyes scanning past me into the house. They asked me to step outside. I did, barefoot and shaking the cool, early morning air biting into my skin. Dawn was creeping in at the edges of the sky, that pale gray-blue light that makes everything look tired and unfinished. My street no longer looked threatening. It looked quiet, empty, normal. The officers moved through the house methodically, while I stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket one of them had given me. I watched them check rooms, open doors, shine flashlights into corners. They spoke quietly to each other, professional and controlled. No urgency, no raised voices, no sign that they expected to find anyone. They didn't. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged locks. The front door was still deadbolted. The chain hung exactly where it should have been. The sliding glass door in the back was intact, locked. At least it appeared to be. One of the officers checked the living room window. He pushed on it lightly, and the latch slid open with barely any resistance. "Latch sticks?" he asked, glancing back at me. I nodded, my throat tight. He nodded too, like that explained everything and nothing at the same time. He made a note on his pad and moved on. They walked the backyard last. I followed them at a distance, my stomach sinking with every step closer to the patio. The floodlight was off now, the yard washed in that dim, early morning gray. At first glance, nothing looked disturbed. No footprints in the grass. No damage to the fence. Then I saw the chair. It was closer to the house than it had been before, not dramatically so, just enough to be undeniable. The plastic legs were angled toward the living room window, positioned as if someone had dragged it there deliberately and then adjusted it until the view was right. One of the officers crouched and examined it, then looked up at the window, following the line of sight. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "Anyone else live here?" he asked. "No," I said. "Just me." They finished their search quickly after that. Too quickly. There was nothing else to find. No intruder. No proof beyond my shaken state, and a patio chair in the wrong place. One of the officers gave me the standard advice: check locks, fix the window latch, consider a security system. He asked if I wanted to file a report. I said yes, because I needed there to be a record. I needed someone else to acknowledge that something had happened. When they finally left, the sun was just starting to crest over the rooftops, the street filled with early morning sounds, cars starting a garbage truck, rumbling in the distance, a bird calling from somewhere nearby. Life resumed around my house like nothing had interrupted it. I went back inside alone. The house felt wrong in daylight, too exposed, too quiet without the excuse of night. I walked through the rooms, slowly, noticing details I had ignored 1,000 times before: the scuff on the wall near the hallway, the crooked picture frame above the couch, the mail still sitting on the coffee table where I'd left it. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper lay on the kitchen counter, positioned neatly beside the fruit bowl. It hadn't been there before. I knew that, with a certainty that made my hands go cold. I picked it up with shaking fingers. It was torn from a notepad, the edge ragged. The writing was simple, careful printed, rather than cursive. No rush, no smudging. It read, "Next time, don't turn the lights off." I stood there for a long time, staring at that note, the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, the house humming around me like it always had. The refrigerator cycled on. The air conditioner clicked back to life. Everything looked normal. But that scrap of paper did what the empty rooms and the quiet yard couldn't. It proved he had been real. And it proved something else too. Something far worse than the idea of a stranger in my home. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't fled. He had stayed long enough to write a message. Long enough to stand in my kitchen in my space while I hid in the dark and waited for help. And as I folded the note and felt the paper crackle between my fingers, I understood that whatever had happened that night wasn't over just because the police couldn't find him. It was over because he decided it was. By the time the sun was fully up, the night already felt like something my mind wanted to misfile, as if it belonged to a bad dream, rather than a real sequence of hours I had lived through. That was the most unsettling part. The world didn't react to what had happened. The street didn't change. The house didn't collapse. No alarms went off beyond the brief wail of police sirens that had faded before dawn. Life resumed with an almost insulting ease. I didn't sleep after the officers left. I sat on the edge of my bed, fully dressed, staring at the wall until my phone alarm went off for work. When it did, the sound made me flinch so hard my chest tightened. The tone was the same one I'd used for years, a soft electronic chime meant to ease me awake. That morning, it felt like a shock collar. I stood in the shower, longer than usual, letting the hot water pound against my shoulders, trying to rinse off the lingering tension. The bathroom filled with steam blurring the mirror until my reflection dissolved into a vague shape. For a moment, I was grateful for that grateful not to see my own face, pale and strained eyes still too wide. I told myself the water was grounding me, that the sensation was proof I was here awake safe. But even then, my ears strained for sounds beyond the curtain, the click of the bathroom lock, the faint hum of the fan. The house was empty, and I knew it was empty, yet my body didn't trust that knowledge. Every small noise made my muscles tense. When I shut off the water, the sudden quiet felt aggressive. I drove to work on autopilot. The roads were busier than usual, filled with commuters, delivery trucks, people sipping coffee and staring straight ahead like nothing in the world could reach them inside their cars. Red lights, green lights, familiar turns. I followed the same route I always had, but something about it felt altered, exposed, as if the act of moving through public space had lost its invisibility. At one stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the expression on my face. I looked alert in a way that felt wrong, like a hunted animal trying to blend in. My shoulders were tight. My jaw ached from being clenched. When the light turned green, the car behind me honked because I hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. The warehouse looked exactly the same as it always did. Same squat building, same loading bays, Same buzzing neon sign that flickered just enough to be annoying, but never enough to get fixed. I parked in my usual spot and sat in the car for a moment, engine running, listening to it idle. The sound was comforting, familiar, predictable. Inside, the fluorescent lights hit me like a physical thing. They washed the space in a harsh, buzzing brightness that flattened everything it touched. Shadows didn't exist under fluorescence. There was nowhere for anything to hide. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The warehouse smelled like cardboard and machine oil and burnt coffee. Pallets sat stacked in their usual places. Forklifts beeped as they reversed. My co-workers clustered near the time clock, talking about sports, about a busted vending machine, about someone's kid getting suspended from school. Ordinary complaints. Ordinary laughter. "Rough night," one of them asked when he saw my face. I nodded and said something vague about not sleeping well. He laughed and told me I was getting old. Someone else chimed in about needing more caffeine. The conversation moved on without me, and I was grateful for that. I didn't trust my voice to stay steady if I tried to explain anything more. I clocked in and went to my station, grateful for the structure of the job. Scan, lift, stack, repeat. The work required just enough focus to keep my mind occupied, just enough repetition to dull the edges of my thoughts. For short stretches, I almost felt normal again. Almost. The feeling crept in slowly, subtle enough that I could pretend it wasn't real at first. It wasn't a specific thought or image. It was a sensation, like a pressure between my shoulder blades. The sense that my back was exposed. That if I turned too quickly, I might catch someone looking away. I told myself it was residual adrenaline, trauma hangover. The body takes time to calm down after a scare. That's what articles say. That's what people say. The mind heals, the nerves settle, normal returns. But every time I lifted my head, my eyes scanned the warehouse automatically. I checked the far corners, the break room doorway, the narrow windows near the ceiling that let in slanted bars of daylight. I watched reflections in the polished concrete floor, alert for movement that didn't belong. Nothing happened, and yet the feeling didn't go away. During break, I sat alone at a metal table and stared at my phone without actually reading anything on it. My co-workers joked nearby, their voices blending into a low hum. Someone heated up leftovers in the microwave, and the familiar mechanical buzz made my skin prickle. I found myself listening for the end of the cycle, for the beep that would cut through the noise. When it did, my heart jumped. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and tried to breathe through it. "You're safe," I told myself. "You're at work. You're surrounded by people." The thought should have reassured me. Instead, it sparked another one I didn't like. He knew where I lived. That simple fact echoed in my head all day. He knew my house well enough to know about the window latch, well enough to move through it silently, well enough to turn off the AC to open the refrigerator to stand in my kitchen and write a note. The realization followed me through every task. If he knew that much, how much else did he know? My schedule, my routines, the hours I was gone, the nights Jenna worked, the times. The house was empty. I started replaying my own habits in my head, like footage from a security camera. Leaving for work at the same time each day, parking in the same spot, sitting on the patio on weekends, lights on, lights off. Patterns I had never questioned before. By the end of my shift, my head ached from the constant vigilance. When I clocked out, the neon sign outside buzzed again, its sound suddenly sharp against my nerves. I flinched, then felt stupid for flinching. The drive home was worse. Every car behind me felt too close. Every vehicle that followed me for more than a block made my pulse spike. At one point, I took an unnecessary turn just to see if the car behind me would continue. It didn't. I laughed under my breath, a short, humorless sound, and shook my head at myself. You're spiraling, I thought, but when I pulled into my driveway, the laughter died. The house looked the same, as it always had, sitting quietly at the end of the cul-de-sac. Curtains drawn. Yard undisturbed. Nothing visibly wrong. And yet, stepping out of my car, I felt that same pressure again, the sense of being exposed, of being seen. I scanned the windows before unlocking the door. I checked the shadows along the fence line. I listened to the wind move through the trees. My routine had changed without me consciously deciding it would. Inside the house greeted me with its usual sounds. Refrigerator hum, air conditioner click, familiar comforting noises. I locked the door this time, deliberately testing the knob afterward, feeling the resistance, the certainty of it. I checked the living room window latch and pushed until it caught. Only then did I let myself exhale. That night, as I sat on the couch under the blue glow of the TV, I realized something unsettling. The fear hadn't faded with daylight. It hadn't stayed behind at the house or at the front door, or in the dark hours before dawn. It had followed me. And beneath that fear, something else was beginning to form. Not panic, not yet. Attention. A growing awareness of details I'd ignored my entire life. Sounds, movements, patterns, my own and everyone else's. I told myself I was just trying to feel safe again. But deep down, a quieter, more disturbing thought was taking shape, one I wasn't ready to admit. I wasn't just afraid of him coming back. I was starting to look for him. It wasn't my idea to look at the footage. I wish I could say it was wish. I could claim some rational instinct kicked in and told me to gather evidence to understand what had happened with a clear head. The truth is simpler and worse. I ran into my neighbor by accident, and curiosity did the rest. His name was Mark, late 40s, maybe early 50s. The kind of guy who waved when he saw you, but never lingered long enough for conversation. He lived 2 houses down closer to the corner, and his driveway faced the street in a way that gave him a clear view of anyone coming or going. I'd noticed the small black dome of his security camera before, mounted under the eave above his garage, angled just slightly toward the cul-de-sac. I noticed it a lot more after that night. I was getting my mail when he came out to take his trash cans back in. We exchanged the usual nods, the automatic politeness of neighbors who share space, but not lives. I almost walked back inside without saying anything, almost let the moment pass. But the thought that had been chewing at me all day, the thought that maybe someone else had seen something I hadn't pushed its way to the surface. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet afternoon. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" He looked at me for a second, then shrugged. "Sure." I hesitated, suddenly aware of how unhinged I might sound. I kept my tone casual, measured. "Do you have cameras on your place? Like, outside?" Mark glanced back at his garage, then nodded. "Yeah, front and side." Why the word "why" hung between us heavy. I swallowed and forced myself to keep going. "Did you happen to see anything weird the other night? Someone walking around, hanging out?" He frowned just slightly. "What night?" "Early yesterday morning, after midnight." He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted past me down the street, as if he were replaying something in his head. That pause was enough to make my stomach drop. Yeah, he said finally. Actually, yeah, I did. My chest tightened. You did. He nodded slowly. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was a friend of yours or something. You okay? I told him about the police, about the man in the backyard, about the note on my counter. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I stuck to facts because facts felt safer. When I finished, Mark's expression had shifted from mild curiosity to something closer to concern. Come inside, he said. I'll show you. His garage smelled like motor oil and cut grass. We walked past shelves stacked with old paint cans and boxes of Christmas decorations and into a small office just off the kitchen. The room was dim lit, mostly by the glow of a computer monitor. Mark sat down at the desk and clicked his mouse a few times, pulling up a grid of camera feeds. This one faces the street, he said, pointing. This one catches part of your place too, especially at night when the street light's on. My mouth felt dry as I leaned in beside him. He scrubbed backward through the footage, the timestamp in the corner ticking down minute by minute. The video was grainy, slightly warped at the edges, but clear enough to make out shapes and movement. Cars passed. Headlights flared. The street went quiet. There, Mark said, stopping the video. At first, I didn't see anything. Then he pointed to the far edge of the frame near the line of shadow where my front yard began. A figure stood there. It was hard to tell details from the footage, alone height build clothing, but the posture was unmistakable. The man stood, with his weight shifted slightly to one side, arms hanging loose, head angled toward my house. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't doing anything that suggested he was waiting for a ride or trying to be discreet. He was just standing there. My heart began to race as Mark hit play again. The timestamp advanced. The man didn't move. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2 minutes. The camera feed flickered slightly as the system adjusted for low light. He stays like that for a while, Mark said quietly. That's what caught my attention when I first checked it. How long, I asked. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. Let's see. Mark fast-forwarded. The man remained in the same spot, his silhouette barely shifting, except for the occasional subtle change in posture, like a slow redistribution of weight. He didn't wander. He didn't leave the frame. He didn't approach the house yet. 10 minutes. 15. Jesus, I muttered. And this, Mark, said, rewinding again. This is the part that bothered me. He scrubbed back further in the footage to a timestamp I hadn't expected to see. 11:58 p.m. My breath caught. That's before I got home, I said. Mark nodded. Yeah, that's what I thought too. We watched as the figure appeared at the edge of the frame, same posture, same stillness. He stepped into view slowly, then stopped. Just stood there, facing my house. He had been there before I arrived. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My knees felt weak. I had to lean a hand on the desk to steady myself. All the assumptions I'd made that he'd shown up after I was already inside, that the night had escalated, suddenly crumbled under the weight of that single fact. He had been waiting. Waiting while I was still at work. Waiting while my house was empty. Waiting while my routines played out exactly the way they always did. Mark continued scrubbing through the footage, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The man would stand still for long stretches, sometimes disappearing from the frame, only to reappear minutes later in almost the exact same spot. He never approached quickly, never rushed. Every movement was deliberate, measured like he was timing something. Looks like he watched your place for a while, Mark said. Didn't seem in a hurry. I nodded numbly. my eyes glued to the screen. When the footage reached the moment I'd seen him in the backyard chair, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The camera didn't capture the chair itself, but it caught the man's silhouette shifting his body, turning slightly, as if aligning with something out of frame. My window. We watched him move out of view, toward the side of the house. Mark paused the video. "I can give this to the police," he said, "if you want." I nodded again. Yeah, I think that would be good." But even as I said it, I knew something had changed. The footage didn't make me feel safer. It didn't bring relief. It didn't offer closure. It did something worse. It gave shape to the fear. That night hadn't been spontaneous. It hadn't been a coincidence. The man hadn't stumbled onto my house by chance. He had stood there motionless, studying my routines, learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment to move. And as Mark saved the clips to a flash drive, I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. If he had been willing to stand still for that long, if patience came that naturally to him, then whatever he wanted from me hadn't changed just because one night had ended. He had already proven that he could wait. I didn't go straight home after Mark showed me the footage. I told him I needed some air, thanked him for his help, and walked back down the driveway like my legs still remembered how to move, even though my head didn't. The street looked the same as it always had. Neat lawns, parked cars, a couple of porch flags stirring lazily in the breeze. It was late afternoon now, sunlight pouring down in a way that should have made everything feel safer. Instead, it made me feel exposed. I sat in my car, with the engine off, and stared at my house from the curb. From this distance, it looked small, ordinary, vulnerable. I tried to imagine how it must have looked to him, from the street, standing there in the dark, while I was still at work, watching the lights stay off, watching the driveway remain empty, waiting. The words settled into my chest and stayed there. Mark had sent me copies of the clips on my phone before I left. I opened them, now thumb, hovering for a moment before pressing play. The video started with the familiar grainy view of the cul-de-sac streetlight glow, washing everything in pale yellow. Cars passed occasionally. Headlights flared and vanished. And then, just like before, the figure appeared at the edge of the frame. I watched it again and again and again. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The stillness, the way he positioned himself where my house was always in view. The fact that he never leaned against anything, never sat down, never shifted enough to suggest boredom. He stood like someone who had decided that standing was part of the job. I scrubbed forward to another clip. Different night, different timestamp. There he was again. Not every night, but enough that the pattern started to form. He appeared, stood, disappeared, then reappeared. Sometimes earlier in the evening, sometimes closer to midnight. Always in roughly the same spot, always facing the same direction. Always my house. My breathing turned shallow as I scrolled through the timestamps. Some of them went back farther than I expected, weeks, maybe longer. The dates blurred together as my brain struggled to accept what my eyes were showing me. He had been there before the night I heard the whistle. He had been there on nights when nothing happened. Nights when I came home, ate dinner, watched TV, went to bed, without ever knowing I'd been observed. Nights when I sat on the patio with Jenna, laughing, tired, but comfortable, completely unaware that someone across the street or just out of sight might have been memorizing the rhythm of our lives. That realization made my skin crawl. I thought back to the times I'd felt watched before and dismissed it as paranoia. The nights when the backyard light had been on for no reason. The vague sense of presence I couldn't place. The moments when I'd glanced out the window and seen nothing, then shrugged and moved on. All those moments rearranged themselves in my memory, forming a new shape. This hadn't started with the whistle. The whistle had just been the first time he wanted me to know he was there. I drove home slowly, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, to side streets, to any car that lingered too long behind me. Every pedestrian made my pulse jump. Every shadow felt heavier than it should have. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there again, scanning the street before getting out. Inside, I locked the door and checked the window latch. Again, then again, just to be sure. I walked the perimeter of the house like I was inspecting a crime scene, checking the sliding door, the bathroom window, the side gate. Everything was secure. Everything looked normal. That didn't help. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the footage one more time this time, watching it with a different question in mind. What was he waiting for? It became obvious the longer I looked. He never approached when the house was busy. On nights when Jenna's car was in the driveway, he stayed farther back, sometimes not appearing at all. On nights when I came home later than usual, he lingered longer. When the lights went off earlier, he moved closer. He wasn't guessing. He was learning. The routines I'd taken for granted, the predictability of my life, had given him a schedule, a map. He knew when I got home. He knew when the house was quiet. He knew when I was alone. And the most unsettling part was this: he hadn't needed to rush. He could afford to wait because he had already chosen his target. This wasn't a drunk wandering into the wrong yard. It wasn't a thief casing houses at random. It wasn't bad luck or coincidence or a one-time scare. This was deliberate. I thought about the way he'd tested the doors, gently, patiently, about the way he'd spoken through the door, calm and close, as if he knew exactly how far he could go without forcing the situation, about the way he'd turned off the AC to strip the house of sound of cover. Those weren't the actions of someone improvising. They were the actions of someone who had rehearsed. I felt something shift inside me, then not panic, not yet. Something colder, sharper, an understanding that settled into place with disturbing clarity. He hadn't approached before because he hadn't needed to. He was gathering information, timing reactions, learning how I moved, how I responded to uncertainty, how long it took me to call for help. The night he finally crossed the boundary hadn't been chosen at random. It had been chosen because he believed it was the right moment. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, my chest tight, my mind racing. The house felt smaller now, its walls thinner, its familiar sounds no longer comforting. The refrigerator hummed, the air conditioner clicked on, and for a split second, I imagined him listening to those same noises from outside, cataloging them the way I did. That was the moment the story changed in my head. The night with the whistle and the chair and the note was no longer the beginning. It was a chapter, and whatever was happening to me wasn't a random horror that had wandered into my life by chance. It was something that had been watching, something that had been waiting, something that had chosen me. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. That was the lie I leaned on during the day, the one that let me shower, eat, drive work. The one that made it possible to stand in line at the grocery store and pretend I wasn't measuring the distance between exits. The one that let me fall asleep at all. I repeated it silently, like a mantra, until the words lost meaning and became sound, harmless, empty sound. It still happened. It was 3 nights later. I remember, because I'd circled the date on my calendar in pen earlier that evening, marking a follow-up appointment with the landlord about the window latch. I remember, because Jenna had called me from her break room, her voice tired but warm, asking if I was doing okay now. I remember because I lied to her and said yes. That night, I left the lights on. Not all of them, just enough to feel less alone. The living room lamp stayed lit. The kitchen light stayed on low. The hallway light cast a thin yellow strip toward the bedroom door. I didn't turn the TV on this time. I didn't want noise. Noise could hide things. Noise could make me miss something important. I checked the locks twice before bed. Front door, deadbolt, chain, sliding door, window latches, especially the one in the living room. I pressed until it caught, then pressed again, harder, until my thumb ached. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the glass, my reflection layered over the dark outside, like a second, weaker version of myself. When I finally lay down, I didn't turn the bedroom light off right away. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe, refrigerator hum, air conditioner cycling, the faint electrical buzz inside the walls. All the same sounds as before, but now each one felt like a checkpoint, something I had to notice, catalog, remember. Eventually, exhaustion did what fear couldn't stop. My eyelids grew heavy. My thoughts lost their sharp edges. I turned the lamp off and let the room fall into shadow, telling myself I'd earned a few hours of rest. Sleep didn't come easily. I drifted, surfaced, drifted again. Half dreams tangled with real memories. The backyard chair, the note on the counter, the stillness on the camera footage. At some point, I rolled onto my side and pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, like it could shield me from anything more than cold. I woke up to the sound before I woke up to the fear. A familiar sound, the whistle. It wasn't loud. It never was. It slid into my awareness, the way smoke does, quiet, invasive, impossible to ignore once you notice it. One long note held steady, then released, outside, near the bedroom window. My eyes opened instantly. My body went rigid, every muscle locking into place, as if movement itself might invite something worse. I didn't sit up. I didn't turn my head. I stared straight ahead into the dark, my pulse thudding in my ears so loudly it felt like it might drown everything else out. I told myself not to look. That was the first decision I made consciously that night. The last time I'd looked, I'd given him something. Proof that I saw him. Proof that his presence mattered. This time, I wouldn't make that mistake. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I wouldn't confirm anything. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the vague outline of the door, listening. The whistle came again. Same note, same length, same deliberate control. Not playful, not mocking. Patient. My mouth went dry. I pressed my lips together, willing my breathing to stay slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Quiet, controlled, invisible. I waited for footsteps. None came. I waited for the scrape of the chair. Nothing. The night stretched thin around the sound, the whistle hanging there like a question. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. I could feel the sweat cooling along my spine. Then he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to project it through the glass. He spoke at a volume meant for one person and one person only. "I don't need you to look," he said. The words cut through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that could block out sound the way it blocks out light. My stomach twisted a deep, sickening pull. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't testing. He was responding. He knew exactly what I was doing. I lay there frozen, the blanket pulled up to my chin like a useless shield. The house noises felt too loud now, too revealing. The refrigerator hummed. The air conditioner clicked. I imagined him listening to them the way I did, noting their rhythm, the way they masked and exposed other sounds. "You're quieter tonight." He continued, his voice, steady, almost conversational. "That's good." My heart lurched. The implication settled in slowly, like a bruise forming under the skin. He had noticed the difference. He had noticed my behavior change. He had come back because of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to bolt out of bed and run into the hallway, turn on every light, call 911, and shout into the phone until someone answered. I wanted to do something, anything, that broke the stillness. But I didn't. Because something about his tone made it clear that movement was exactly what he wanted. The whistle returned shorter this time, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Then silence. Seconds passed, maybe minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. My sense of time had collapsed inward, shrinking down to the space between my breaths. I listened so hard my ears rang. Every tiny shift of fabric, every swallow felt like a mistake waiting to be punished. Then his voice came again, closer than before. "I was starting to think you didn't want to talk." The word talk echoed in my head. This wasn't about getting inside. Not yet. This wasn't about stealing or smashing or forcing anything. He had already proven he could do those things if he wanted to. This was about me, about whether I would respond, about whether I would break. I realized then that my silence wasn't frustrating him. It was interesting him. My throat burned with the effort of holding everything in. My hands clenched the blanket so tightly my fingers ached. I stared into the darkness, refusing to turn my head, refusing to give him the confirmation he was fishing for. Outside the window, the night stayed still. Inside, my chest, fear bloomed into something heavier, something closer to helplessness. Because the more I stayed quiet, the clearer it became that he wasn't going to leave just because I ignored him. He had come back not to scare me. He had come back to see how I would answer. And as I lay there listening to his breathing outside my window, I understood a terrible truth. This time, he wasn't testing the house. He was testing me. I stayed in bed until my muscles began to cramp from holding still. The impulse to look was almost unbearable, not because I wanted to see him, but because part of my brain still believed that if I could confirm his shape with my eyes, I could somehow control it. Sound was too intimate. Sound slid under doors. Sound turned the dark into a living thing. I wanted the clean certainty of sight. I didn't give in. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening for the smallest shifts outside my window. For a long stretch, there was nothing. No whistle, no voice, no footsteps. Just the house noises continuing their indifferent routine. The refrigerator cycled. The AC clicked on, pushed cool air through the vent, then clicked off again. The world tried to pretend it was ordinary. Then I heard movement. Not at the window. At the front of the house. It started with the faint crunch of gravel near the driveway. A slow, measured sound. Then the soft creak of the porch step as weight settled on it. The man didn't hurry. He didn't try to be quiet in a way that suggested fear of being caught. He moved like he owned the time. I slid out of bed and crossed to the bedroom door, careful not to let it click. I stood in the hallway bare feet, cold on the floor phone in my hand. The living room lamp was still on, casting a dull pool of yellow light across the carpet. The front door was visible from where I stood, the deadbolt's metal catching a faint glint. I waited, listening. The doorbell didn't ring this time. Instead, he knocked. 3 slow taps. Not hard, not aggressive. More like the knock of a delivery driver who knows you're home and wants you to come sign for a package. My pulse spiked. My hand tightened around my phone. I hovered over the keypad, ready to dial, but I didn't. There was a sick part of me that wanted to know what he would say. Because if he was speaking, he wasn't breaking in. If he was speaking, maybe I could buy time. That logic was thin and desperate, but it was enough to keep me frozen in place. He knocked again once. A single tap that sounded almost polite. Then his voice came through the door, calm and close, like he was standing with his forehead nearly touching the wood. Eric. Hearing my name out loud, my actual name, hit harder than any threat could have. It wasn't just fear, it was violation. It was the sudden collapse of the thin wall between my private life and whatever this was. My mouth went dry. My tongue felt too large in my throat. I hadn't told him my name. I hadn't answered him. I hadn't confronted him. The police hadn't called out to him. There was no reason he should know it. And yet he said it with such easy certainty, like he'd been saying it to himself for days. Eric. He repeated quieter this time, almost like a correction. You don't have to hide in there. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had he seen my mail? The stack on my coffee table? The name on my Amazon packages by the door? Had he been inside longer than I realized? Long enough to go through my things, to read what he wanted? Or had he watched me so long, he'd learned it another way? Heard someone say, it's seen it on a badge, caught it in conversation through an open window. The idea that he'd gathered it casually like a detail on a shopping list made my stomach churn. I took a small step backward, putting more distance between myself and the front door, as if space could protect me from words. The living room lamp buzzed faintly. The house felt too quiet otherwise, like it was leaning in to listen. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, still calm, still steady. Not tonight, not tonight. The phrase chilled me more than an outright threat. It implied options. It implied planning. It implied that hurt had been considered and filed away like something he could choose later. My thumb hovered over 911 again. I stared at the screen, the numbers bright and accusatory. Call now, I told myself. Call before you do something stupid. Call before you let him keep talking. But then he spoke again, and the words pinned me in place. Jenna's working the overnight again, right? My blood went cold. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. My lungs locked up, like my body had forgotten how to function. That wasn't a guess. The tone wasn't questioning. It was casual, almost conversational, like he was making small talk with someone he'd known for years. Like he had a right to say her name and mention her schedule. I felt a surge of anger so sharp it almost broke through the fear. My hand trembled. My jaw tightened. The thought of him knowing anything about Jenna, anything about her life, her routine made something in me want to explode. How do you know that? I whispered, and then immediately regretted it. The sound of my own voice felt like stepping into a spotlight. It proved I was there. It proved I was listening. It gave him exactly what he wanted: interaction. He didn't answer right away. I heard a quiet exhale on the other side of the door, almost like a soft laugh, but not quite. "See?" he said gently. "You can talk." My skin crawled. I backed up another step, my bare heel catching on the edge of the rug. The phone shook in my hand as if it had its own pulse. He spoke again, softer now, and it felt like the words were slipping under the door, seeping into the house. "I know you leave for the warehouse at 4:30, he continued. "Sometimes 4:25 if you're early. You park in the same spot every time. You check your mirrors twice before you pull out." My stomach dropped with each sentence. The details were too specific, too mundane to be invented. These weren't dramatic facts. They were the small, stupid patterns of my life that I hadn't even realized were patterns. He kept going. Voice still calm, still measured. "You always lock your car first," he said. "Then you lock the door. But you didn't check the window until after. You're doing better now. Doing better." Like this was a game. Like this was training. Like my fear was something he could shape and evaluate. I clenched my teeth, fighting the urge to scream at him, to demand he leave, to threaten him with the police. But I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't afraid of threats. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't unstable. He sounded patient, interested, enjoying himself. And that was what made him feel so dangerous. Not the possibility of violence, but the calm control of someone who didn't need violence to win. I lifted my phone closer to my face, finally ready to dial, when he spoke one more time. One final detail that made my hand freeze again. "She gets off around 7, he said, almost thoughtfully. "Sometimes later, if they're short-staffed. You'll check your phone at 6:45. You always do." My throat tightened so hard it hurt. The room felt like it was tilting. The world narrowed down to the front door, and the voice behind it, the casual way he handled my life like it belonged to him. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell myself he was bluffing, but my body knew the truth. My body recognized the accuracy in those details, the way it recognized the sound of my own footsteps. He wasn't making conversation to pass time. He was showing me what he had learned. He was proving he had been close enough for long enough to understand my routine better than I did. And beneath that calm, measured tone, I heard the real message, the one he didn't need to say out loud. "I've been here the whole time. You just didn't notice." The silence after he finished speaking was heavier than anything he'd said. I stood there in the hallway, phone raised, but useless, in my shaking hand, every muscle locked in place, like I'd been caught mid-fall. My heart was racing so fast, it felt out of rhythm, like it was skipping beats, just to keep up with the fear. I waited for him to laugh, to threaten me outright, to do something, anything that would turn this into a situation with clear rules. He didn't. On the other side of the door, I heard him shift his weight slightly. The wood creaked faintly under the pressure, a small, intimate sound that told me exactly how close he was. Close enough to rest his hand flat against the door. Close enough to feel the vibration of my breathing if he leaned in. "You're doing the right thing," he said after a moment. His voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still steady, still horrifyingly reasonable, staying quiet, staying still. My stomach twisted. The idea that he was approving of my fear made something inside me recoil. I swallowed hard and finally forced myself to press the phone to my ear, ready to call, ready to speak, ready to let someone else hear what was happening. Before I could dial, he spoke again, cutting cleanly through the motion like he'd anticipated it. "But you can't do that forever." The words landed softly without emphasis, and that was what made them sink so deep. They weren't a challenge. They weren't a threat in the traditional sense. They were a statement of fact, delivered the same way someone might comment on the weather or the time of day. I leaned back against the wall, my legs suddenly weak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't trust my voice. I didn't trust myself not to beg or shout or say something that would make this worse. He seemed to sense that too. "I'll wait," he said, almost kindly, "until you stop hiding." A chill spread through my chest, slow and deliberate. The sentence didn't need embellishment. It didn't need explanation. It carried its meaning perfectly on its own. Waiting, not breaking in, not forcing the door, not chasing me through the house or doing anything that would justify immediate obvious action. He wasn't going to give me that clarity. He wasn't going to turn this into a single terrifying moment I could survive and move past. He was going to stretch it. I pictured him out there in the dark, patient as ever, watching my lights, my movements, my hesitation. I imagined him stepping back into the shadows of the yard, taking his time knowing that the real work had already been done. He had planted himself in my head. He had turned my own house into something uncertain. I waited for him to say more, to explain what would happen if I didn't stop hiding, to threaten Jenna, to threaten me, to make the rules explicit. He didn't. Instead, I heard the softest sound of retreating footsteps. They moved away from the door, slowly unhurried, the same deliberate pace he'd used all night. Each step felt like a decision, like punctuation. The porch step creaked again under his weight, then released it. Gravel crunched faintly near the driveway. I strained to hear more, my ears aching with the effort. No whistle came this time. No final words. Just the sound of someone leaving because they had decided it was time to leave, not because they were chased away, not because they were afraid, but because they were satisfied. I stood there, long after the sounds faded, phone still pressed uselessly to my ear, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid that if I did anything at all, he might reappear and continue the conversation where he'd left off. My body felt hollowed out, like all the adrenaline had burned through me and left nothing solid behind. Eventually, the house noises crept back in. The refrigerator hummed, the air conditioner clicked on and pushed cool air through the vent. The living room lamp buzzed faintly. All the same sounds that had once made this place feel safe now felt like reminders, evidence that life was continuing whether I wanted it to or not. I sank down onto the floor, my back against the wall, and finally let myself breathe properly. Each inhale shook. Each exhale felt like it took something with it. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't think about calling anyone. I just sat there replaying his words over and over until they lost their sound and became meaning. "I'll wait until you stop hiding." That was the threat. Not violence, not force, not even presence. Waiting. Because waiting meant he didn't need to rush. Waiting meant he believed time was on his side. Waiting meant that sooner or later I would have to live my life again. Turn lights off. Leave the house, sleep, move, exist. And when that happened, when I inevitably slipped, when routine took over and fear loosened its grip just enough, he would be watching to see what I did next. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dim light of my living room until dawn crept in through the windows, washing the house in pale gray. And as the world woke up outside, I understood something with terrible clarity. The night he came back wasn't about breaking in. It was about teaching me that as long as he was willing to wait, I would never feel truly alone again. I told myself leaving was the smart move. That was the phrase I kept using, smart, like this was a chess problem and not a slow erosion of my sanity. The police couldn't do anything without evidence. The landlord could fix the latch, maybe install better locks, but none of that addressed the real issue. The real issue was that my house no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a suggestion. So I packed a bag. I didn't take much. A few changes of clothes, my laptop, chargers, toothbrush, phone. I moved through the house quickly, avoiding mirrors, avoiding windows, avoiding any moment that might slow me down long enough to reconsider. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow felt like it might detach itself and move. I left the lights on when I walked out. All of them. My friend Daniel lived across town, closer to the highway, in a newer development with tighter streets and identical houses lined up, like they were trying to convince themselves they were safe through uniformity. He was single, worked early mornings, and had offered his guest room without asking too many questions. I hadn't told him everything. I didn't trust myself to say it out loud without sounding unhinged. I just need a few nights, I said. Place stuff. Headspace stuff. He nodded the way people do when they don't want to pry. Stay as long as you need. His house smelled different, newer, cleaner, less history baked into the walls. The locks clicked with a heavier, more decisive sound when he turned them. The windows didn't rattle. The floorboards didn't creak. There were cameras mounted under the eaves, small black eyes that watched the driveway and the side yard without blinking. That first night, I slept with the door closed and the lights off, and nothing happened. I woke up disoriented, my body still coiled tight, but the silence was just silence. No whistle, no voice, no sense of pressure between my shoulder blades. I lay there listening to Daniel's house settle, to the distant rush of cars on the highway, to the normal sounds of someone else's life continuing without interruption. Relief came in cautious waves. The second night passed the same way. Then the third. I started to breathe again. I went to work. I laughed at something Daniel said over breakfast. I caught myself scrolling mindlessly on my phone without checking reflections or sound levels. The tension didn't vanish, but it loosened enough that I could almost pretend it had been tied to a place rather than to me. He doesn't know where you are, I told myself. That was the problem. Location, predictability, distance fixes things. That's what people say. You change the setting, you break the pattern. You step out of the frame, and whatever was watching loses interest. On the fourth night, I went to bed earlier than usual. Daniel had an early shift, and the house went quiet by 10. I lay in the guest room staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to a different refrigerator hum, a different AC unit cycle on and off. The sounds were wrong, but in a comforting way. They didn't carry memory. They didn't trigger anything yet. I slept. Not deeply, but enough that I dreamed disconnected images that slid past without weight. For the first time in days, my body seemed to believe I was safe. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was part of the dream. The sound drifted in, gently too soft to demand attention. I floated between sleep and waking my mind, searching for context for something to anchor the noise to. A single note, thin, controlled, a whistle. My eyes opened. The guest room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to convince myself that the sound belonged to this place, that it was different somehow. It came again. Same pitch, same length. Outside. Not near the window, farther away than that. Somewhere beyond the house, carried faintly through the night air. It wasn't loud enough to pinpoint, but it was unmistakable. I felt cold all over, like my body had dropped into ice water. Daniel's neighborhood was quieter than mine had been. Fewer trees, fewer fences. The houses were closer together, the yards smaller. Sound carried differently here. There was nowhere for it to hide. I held my breath and listened. No footsteps, no movement. Just that sound lingering in the air like a fingerprint. My mind raced, desperate for explanations that didn't involve the one I was already forming. Someone walking a dog, a drunk neighbor, kids messing around. Any stranger could whistle. Any sound could resemble another if you were primed to hear it. But my body didn't care about logic. My body recognized the cadence. The whistle came a third time closer now, or maybe just clearer. The note hung for a second longer before fading. I slid out of bed, slowly, my bare feet sinking into the unfamiliar carpet. Every step felt wrong, like I was trespassing in my own fear. I approached the window from the side, just like before, careful not to cast a shadow. I didn't look outside. I didn't need to. The sound wasn't trying to lure me to the glass. It wasn't asking for confirmation. It was doing what it had always done, announcing presence, marking territory. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked it. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to the night settle around the sound. Eventually, the whistle stopped. The silence afterward was complete, unnatural in its suddenness. No follow-up. No voice. No footsteps retreating. Just the hum of the house and the distant rush of traffic, like nothing had intruded at all. I stood there until my legs began to shake. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Daniel. I didn't tell him I'd heard something outside. I didn't ask if he'd heard it too. I watched him drink his coffee, tie his shoes, leave for work like any other morning. I sat alone in the quiet house and tried to understand what had happened. It couldn't be coincidence. The odds were too thin. The sound had been too precise, too familiar, too deliberate. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was that leaving hadn't mattered. That whatever connection I thought I'd broken by changing locations hadn't been tied to the house at all. That the routines I'd disrupted weren't the ones that mattered. I thought about the footage, about the stillness, about the patience, about the way he'd spoken, calm and certain, as if distance were irrelevant. I'll wait until you stop hiding. Standing there in someone else's guest room, listening to a silence that no longer felt empty, I understood the full weight of that sentence for the first time. Waiting didn't require proximity. Waiting didn't require access. Waiting only required time. And somehow, no matter where I went, he still had that. After the whistle at Daniel's place, I stopped trusting silence. It didn't matter how quiet a room was, or how normal the neighborhood looked in daylight. Silence no longer meant safety. It meant uncertainty. It meant I hadn't noticed the right sound yet. I told myself I'd imagined it. I tried to treat it like my mind, replaying trauma in a new setting, like my nervous system was stuck on high sensitivity. Daniel's street had teenagers. Teenagers did dumb things. Somebody could have been whistling to a dog, or to a friend, or just because they liked the sound of their own breath in cold air. That explanation was reasonable. It was comforting. It had weight, but it didn't fit the feeling in my body. My body had reacted before my brain could provide a story. It had recognized something it didn't want to recognize. So the next day, I made plans. Real plans. The kind that involved action rather than waiting. I called the landlord again about the latch. I asked Mark to send the footage directly to the police department. I ordered a cheap camera system online that could be delivered to Daniel's house. I looked up self-defense laws late at night and realized how quickly preparing can start to resemble obsession if you aren't careful. And still, I kept trying to function like a normal person. Daniel left early for work. I stayed behind working remotely from his kitchen table, answering emails and pretending my hands weren't slightly unsteady on the keyboard. Around noon, I drove to my house to pick up more clothes. I told myself it would be quick 10 minutes in and out. I parked in the driveway and locked the car like I always did, then paused, suddenly aware of how familiar that motion was. The house looked unchanged. No broken windows, no obvious signs of anything. Just sunlight on siding a neighbor, watering plants, a dog barking somewhere down the street. I went inside anyway, with the kind of caution you'd usually reserve for walking into a stranger's home. I checked the living room window first, pressing the latch hard, testing it, then testing it again. I grabbed a few shirts from the bedroom, a jacket, a pair of shoes. My heart didn't slow the entire time. It stayed elevated as if it expected the air itself to turn. Nothing happened. I returned to Daniel's place, feeling both relieved and foolish. The afternoon passed in a blur of tasks that didn't matter. When Daniel got home, we ate takeout and watched something light on TV. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded along to his stories from work. I even felt myself relax a little, like my body was finally willing to accept that I had taken the right step. That night, I went to bed with the guest room door locked. Daniel's house had heavier locks, solid, satisfying, the kind that made a decisive sound when they engaged. I lay there listening to the new noises I was learning, the water heater, cycling the subtle creak of the stairs, when the temperature changed the far-off rush of the highway. My mind drifted reluctantly toward sleep. No whistle came. I woke up groggy, sweaty, and angry at myself for the relief I felt. The morning light made everything look safe again. It softened the edges. It suggested that what happened at night belonged to darkness alone. Daniel left for work. I stayed behind trying to focus. Around mid-morning, I realized I needed to run errands, pick up the camera system that had arrived at a local shipping hub, grab groceries, do the little things that pretend life is still life. I stepped outside and froze. My car sat in Daniel's driveway where I'd left it, but something about it looked wrong. Not damaged, not obviously disturbed, just altered. Like the scene had been edited while I slept. It took me a second to understand why. There was a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. For a moment, my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Paper under a wiper is a normal thing. A flyer, a parking warning, a neighbor's note about trash day. But my body reacted instantly. My chest tightened, my mouth went dry. My skin prickled as if the air itself had turned cold. I walked toward the car, slowly, eyes scanning the street, the neighboring driveways, the sidewalk. Nothing moved. No one stood watching. The houses looked calm. A sprinkler ticked as it rotated. Somewhere a lawnmower droned faintly. Daylight continued doing its convincing job. I reached the car and lifted the wiper carefully as if it might snap or set off an alarm. The paper came free, with a soft scrape. The sound felt too loud. I held it in both hands and stared at it before unfolding it, delaying the moment like a child delaying a punishment. It was a torn piece of notepad paper, the same size, same ragged edge. My stomach dropped. I unfolded it. The handwriting was printed careful, slightly slanted. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't messy. It looked almost tidy, like someone who took pride in being understood. The letters were shaped the same way as the note I'd found on my kitchen counter. Same spacing, same pressure, same habits. The sharp, clean lines on certain letters, the way the T-cross sat slightly high, the way the O wasn't a perfect circle, but a narrow oval. I didn't need to compare them side by side to know. It was him. The note read, "Good choice. Different house. Same you." My hands began to shake so badly the paper fluttered. I stared at the words, trying to make them rearrange into something harmless, but they stayed exactly what they were. A message meant for me. A confirmation that the whistle hadn't been a coincidence. A reminder that distance wasn't a wall. I forced myself to breathe deep and slow, but my lungs felt tight. I looked up again, scanning the street, the windows of the neighboring houses, the cars parked along the curb. I couldn't tell if anyone was watching. The truth was, at this point, I couldn't tell if anyone wasn't. My mind raced through possibilities. Had he followed me? Had he watched Daniel's house the way he'd watched mine? Had he already been here before I arrived? Was he someone from the neighborhood? Someone local? Someone who could move through these streets without raising suspicion? Or was he closer than that, someone tied to my routine in a way I hadn't considered? Someone who knew Daniel. Someone who had learned where I went, not by guesswork, but by listening, by watching, by waiting. The note felt warm in my hands, like it had been touched recently. That detail made bile rise in my throat. I imagined him standing in the driveway, in the dark, sliding the paper under the wiper with slow, deliberate fingers. I imagined him doing it without fear, without hurry, as if he had all the time in the world. I went back inside and locked the door. Then I locked it again, checking the bolt. I pulled the curtains and stood in the dimness of the kitchen, staring at the note like it might move on its own. I should have called the police right then. I knew that. I knew it in the same way. You know, you should go to the doctor when something hurts too long. But I also knew what they would ask. Where's the suspect? Did you see him? Any cameras? Any witnesses? I had paper. I had handwriting. I had fear. Fear doesn't photograph well. I took out my phone and pulled up a picture I'd snapped of the kitchen note days earlier. I zoomed in on the letters, comparing them to the paper in my hand. The match was undeniable. My throat tightened as the final confirmation settled in. This wasn't a random prowler who had stumbled onto my house and moved on. This was someone who wanted me to understand that he could reach me anywhere. That leaving wasn't an escape. That changing addresses didn't change the fact that I was still the same person with the same routines, the same tells, the same moments of weakness. The note wasn't just a message. It was a lesson. And as I stood there in Daniel's kitchen with daylight pouring through the windows and ordinary life happening outside, I realized something that made my stomach turn even more than the words themselves. He hadn't broken in. He hadn't hurt anyone. He hadn't done anything loud enough to force immediate action. He had simply found a way to touch my world again, quietly, neatly, undeniably. And if he could do that, Then he could do more whenever he decided the lesson needed to continue. I sat at Daniel's kitchen table for a long time after I found the note, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. The words on the paper replayed in my head, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same calm persistence he used when he spoke. Good choice. Different house. Same you. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was an observation. And the longer I sat with it, the more I understood what it meant. I had been wrong about what leaving was supposed to accomplish. I thought distance would break the pattern. I thought changing houses would confuse him, reset whatever process he'd been following. I thought if I removed myself from the place where it all started, the story would lose momentum and collapse on its own. That belief had kept me moving for days, had given me something to do when doing nothing felt unbearable. But standing there in someone else's kitchen, holding proof that he'd followed without effort, I realized how small that idea had been. This wasn't about location. If it were, the night would have ended at my front door. It would have ended with new locks, fixed latches, police reports filed and forgotten. Houses are interchangeable. Yards blur together. Streets change names. If the house were the point, he would have found another one by now. He hadn't. He'd followed me instead. That truth settled into my chest slowly, like sediment sinking to the bottom of clear water. I replayed everything from the beginning, with that understanding in place, and suddenly the pieces aligned in a way they never had before. The patience, the stillness, the way he'd stood for long periods without moving, without approaching, without doing anything that would draw attention. The way he'd waited for the right night, the right moment, the right response. He wasn't casing houses. He was studying me. My routines weren't just conveniences. They were identifiers. My habits, when I came home, how I moved through my space, the lights I left on the way, I hesitated before calling for help, had all been data points. The night he finally made contact hadn't been random. It had been chosen because he believed he understood me well enough to predict how I would react. And the worst part was that he'd been right. I thought about how long it had taken me to call the police, how I'd hesitated because I didn't want to seem dramatic, how I'd hidden instead of running, listened instead of acting, how I'd stayed quiet, hoping silence would make me invisible. Those weren't universal reactions. They were mine. And somehow, he had learned them. The realization stripped away the last illusion I'd been clinging to, that this could be fixed by better planning, better security, better decisions. Those things mattered, sure, but they weren't the core of it. The core was simpler and more unsettling. He had chosen me because I fit, not because I was weak, not because I was careless, but because my particular combination of caution, routine, and hesitation made me predictable. Because I tried to be rational in moments when instinct might have served me better. Because I valued quiet over confrontation. Because I believed problems could be managed if you didn't escalate them too quickly. Those traits had served me well my entire life, until they didn't. I looked around Daniel's kitchen, the clean counters, the bowl of fruit, the magnets on the fridge holding up old photos and grocery lists. None of it belonged to me, and yet here I was, sitting in the middle of it, carrying something that didn't belong anywhere. The note felt heavier now, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. He wasn't angry that I'd left. He wasn't surprised. He had expected it. That meant he'd anticipated every step I took after that night. The temporary escape, the borrowed safety, the hope that distance would dilute fear. He'd let me have those days because they didn't threaten the outcome. They were part of the process, a way to watch how I adapted, a way to see what I did when I thought I'd regained control. I thought back to his words at my door, the way he'd said he would wait until I stopped hiding. At the time, I'd understood it as a warning about behavior, about Lightslock's silence. Now I heard it differently. He wasn't waiting for me to stop hiding in a house. He was waiting for me to stop hiding behind the idea that this was about a place. The weight of that understanding pressed down on me heavy and inescapable. It meant there was no clean ending where I moved far enough away or disappeared into a new routine and left him behind. It meant that whatever he wanted attention, interaction, control, it was tied to me as a person, not to an address. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket, the paper crackling softly as if it resented being handled. I didn't throw it away. I didn't tear it up. Destroying it wouldn't destroy what it represented. If anything, it felt important to keep it like a record of the moment I finally stopped lying to myself. I had been chosen, not in a dramatic cinematic sense. There was no prophecy, no single defining mistake that marked me. It was quieter than that, more ordinary. The kind of choice that happens when someone watches long enough to recognize a pattern that suits them. That understanding didn't bring relief, but it did bring clarity. For the first time since this started, I wasn't scrambling for explanations or exits. I wasn't telling myself that the next move would fix everything. I was forced to sit with the reality that this wasn't a problem I could outrun or outwait. Whatever this was, whatever he was, it had attached itself to my life in a way that wouldn't be undone by geography. As I sat there in the stillness of someone else's home, I felt something inside me harden. Not courage, not confidence, something colder. A recognition that fear alone wouldn't resolve this, and neither would denial. I didn't know what the next step was yet, but I knew one thing with uncomfortable certainty. This wasn't happening to me by chance. It was happening because of me. And once that truth settled in, there was no going back to believing otherwise. If you're hearing this, I need you to understand something first. I'm not telling this story because it's over. I'm telling it because it isn't. I've gone back and forth for days about whether I should say any of this out loud. Every instinct I have tells me that attention is dangerous, that naming something gives it shape, and shape gives it power. But silence hasn't protected me. Distance didn't help. Routine didn't help. Pretending this was just stress or paranoia didn't help either. So I'm doing the one thing I've avoided since the beginning, speaking directly without hiding behind place or time. I'm talking to you. Not because I want sympathy. Not because I think this will scare you in some abstract, entertaining way. I'm talking to you because whatever this is seems to understand something very specific about people like us. People who listen. People who pay attention. People who stay quiet long enough to notice patterns. That's how it started for me. You've heard everything. Up to this point, the whistle, the chair, the voice, the notes, the waiting. You've heard how carefully it unfolded, how nothing about it was rushed or sloppy or impulsive. What I haven't told you yet is why I'm choosing now to say this publicly instead of to the police or to a therapist or to a lawyer. It's because something changed. Not last night, not even this week. It changed the moment I realized that the worst part of all of this wasn't the fear of being hurt. It was the fear of being observed. of having my reactions cataloged and measured, of knowing that my silence wasn't neutrality, but information. That's when I understood why he talked to me instead of breaking in. And that's when I started to worry about what happens when a story like this gets heard. I'm recording this from a place I'm not going to name. Not because it matters anymore, but because habits die hard. The room is quiet in the way hotels and borrowed spaces are quiet, too neutral, too empty to feel real. There's a faint hum coming from somewhere behind the walls, a mechanical sound I can't quite place. I've been sitting here for hours going over the order of things, making sure I don't leave anything out that might sound like exaggeration. Because I need you to trust me. Not emotionally, practically. I need you to trust that nothing I've described relied on luck or coincidence. Nothing hinged on a single bad decision. This wasn't a night that went wrong. It was a process, and processes don't end just because you recognize them. If you're listening to this the way I think you are, you've probably already started doing something without realizing it. You've adjusted your posture. You've looked up from the screen once or twice. You've noticed the sound in the room you didn't register before: the fan, the fridge, the hum of traffic, the absence of something you expected to hear. That's not an accident. That's the same awareness that made me interesting. I didn't understand it at first. I thought being careful was protection. I thought noticing details meant control. I thought staying quiet was the same thing as staying safe. Those assumptions worked for most of my life. They probably have for yours too, until they don't. Until someone realizes that your caution makes you predictable and your silence makes you readable. He told me once that he didn't like when people hide. I misunderstood that for a long time. I thought he meant physically, doors, rooms, darkness. But what he really meant was this: hiding your reactions doesn't erase them. It just makes them clearer to someone who knows how to look. That's why I'm telling you this now. Because whatever this thing is, whether it's one person or a kind of person, it feeds on recognition. On the moment when you realize you're not just scared, you're being studied. And the moment you accept that the dynamic shifts. I want you to ask yourself something honestly before you keep listening. When was the last time you dismissed a sound because you didn't want to seem dramatic? When was the last time you hesitated to check something because you told yourself it was probably nothing? When was the last time you noticed a pattern and then talked yourself out of it because acknowledging it felt worse than ignoring it? Those questions aren't rhetorical. They're practical. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the difference between coincidence and intention only becomes clear after you start paying attention. And once you do, you can't unsee it. I don't know if he wanted me to tell this story. I don't know if speaking out is a mistake or the only option left. I just know that keeping it contained, keeping it private, didn't stop anything. It just made the circle smaller. So now, I'm widening it. If you're listening late at night, if this story feels uncomfortably close to your own routines, if you've caught yourself thinking, this could happen to anyone, you're right. But it doesn't happen to everyone. It happens to the people who fit, people who notice, people who wait, people who don't want to cause a scene, people who listen all the way to the end. I don't expect you to believe that I'm in danger right now. I don't expect you to panic or turn this off or lock your doors because of something you heard online. That's not how this works. Fear that's too loud burns out quickly. This isn't loud fear. This is quiet. This is the kind of fear that settles in and changes how you move through your life. without ever announcing itself. The kind that makes you question which sounds belong and which ones don't. The kind that teaches you to listen differently. I don't know where he is as I'm saying this. I don't know if he's nearby or far away or watching something else entirely. What I do know is that waiting has always been his strongest advantage. And waiting doesn't require proximity. So if you take anything from this confession, anything at all, let it be this: pay attention to the things you almost ignore. Question the moments that feel slightly off. And don't assume that because something hasn't happened yet, it isn't happening. Because the most unsettling truth I've had to accept isn't that someone chose me. It's that someone like this doesn't need to choose often. They just need to recognize the right person when they hear one. And if you're still listening right now, there's a chance they already have. I didn't plan to keep talking this long. When I started recording, I thought I would say what needed to be said and stop. I thought the act of telling it, of laying everything out in order, might drain some of its weight. That once the words were out there, the room would feel different. Lighter, somehow. Like closing a door you didn't realize had been open. Instead, the longer I talk, the quieter it gets. I'm sitting still now. I haven't moved in a while. Not because I'm afraid to exactly, but because movement feels unnecessary. Every sound in the room has become sharper, more distinct, like the world has been stripped down to individual components instead of a single background hum. The air conditioner clicks off. It's a small sound. Most people wouldn't even notice it. Just a soft plastic tick, followed by the absence of airflow. The vent above me exhales one last breath of cool air and then goes still. The room doesn't warm right away, but the change is immediate. The silence left behind feels intentional, like someone has adjusted a setting rather than waited for a cycle to end. I pause my sentence halfway through without meaning to. I listen. The AC has always been my anchor sound. It fills the gaps, smooths over everything else, gives the night texture. Without it, the room feels hollow, like a stage after the lights go out. I can hear my own breathing now, too loud, too present. I try to slow it down, not because I think someone can hear me, but because the sound feels intrusive. Somewhere behind me, the refrigerator hums. Low, steady, familiar. That sound has followed me through every place I've stayed these past weeks. Different pitch, different rhythm, but always there. It's the kind of noise you stop hearing unless it disappears. A reminder that something is working. Something is alive. I focus on it now, letting it ground me while I continue speaking. My voice sounds strange to my own ears, too close, like it's coming from inside my head instead of my mouth. I clear my throat softly and keep going. Then the refrigerator stops. Not abruptly. Not with a bang or a mechanical failure sound. Just a smooth fade, like someone has gently turned a dial down to 0. The hum dwindles, thins, and then vanishes entirely. The silence that replaces it is absolute. I freeze. Every muscle in my body tightens, not in panic, but in recognition. This is the moment my body remembers before my mind does. I've felt this silence before. I've sat inside it. I've listened to it press in from all sides until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. The quiet is wrong. I don't move. I don't stop recording. I don't raise my voice. I just listen harder than I ever have in my life. The absence of sound sharpens everything else. Tiny shifts in the building. The faint electrical buzz behind the walls. The subtle ringing in my ears that I usually ignore. There are no footsteps, no voice, no whistle. That almost makes it worse. I glance slowly, carefully toward the door, without turning my head all the way. The outline hasn't changed. The shadow beneath it is the same shape it's been for the last hour. Nothing moves across it. Nothing interrupts it. I swallow. My throat makes a small sound. It echoes inside me like I've just shouted. I think about how many times I've dismissed moments like this. How often I've explained away silence as coincidence, as normal mechanical behavior, as nothing worth reacting to. Appliances turn off. Systems cycle. Houses settle. That's what they do. But this isn't settling. This is clearing. It feels like the room is being prepared. I keep talking because stopping feels dangerous. Because the sound of my own voice is the only thing that reminds me I'm still here, still occupying space. Words stack on top of words, not because I'm trying to say something important, but because silence feels like an invitation. My hands are cold now. I hadn't noticed when that started. The hair on my arms is raised. My skin prickling as if the temperature has dropped a few degrees all at once. I shift slightly in my chair, and the faint scrape of fabric against fabric sounds shockingly loud. I stop moving immediately. I listen again. Nothing reacts. That's the part I can't explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. The difference between quiet that's empty and quiet that's attentive. This silence doesn't feel passive. It feels aware, like something is waiting for me to make a mistake so it can respond. I glance at the timestamp on the recording interface. I don't know why. Time hasn't felt real for a while now. Seconds stretch. Minutes collapse. Everything exists in the space between sounds. The AC doesn't click back on. The refrigerator doesn't resume its hum. The systems that should cycle haven't. I realize then that I've been unconsciously counting on them to come back to reassert normality without my permission. Their absence feels like a boundary being crossed, not into chaos, but into control. I lower my voice without deciding to. If you're still listening, I say quietly, this is the part I didn't want to describe. My own words feel intrusive in the stillness. They don't echo, but they linger, hanging in the air longer than they should. I imagine sound waves traveling outward, touching walls, corners, objects I can't see. I become acutely aware of how sound moves, how it escapes rooms, how it slips under doors, how it announces presence even when you don't mean it to. That's when it hits me. This silence isn't accidental. It's curated. I don't know how I know that. I just do. The same way I knew the whistle meant he was there before I understood why. The same way I knew waiting was the threat long before he said it out loud. Silence is the last adjustment. You remove noise and suddenly every reaction becomes visible. Every breath, every swallow, every involuntary movement. Silence turns people into signals. I stop talking, not intentionally. The words just end. I sit there, with the recording still running, my mouth closed, my body perfectly still. The room doesn't respond. The silence holds. Seconds pass, then more. In the absence of everything else, I become painfully aware of a new sound. Not from outside, not from the door, not even from the room. It's coming from the recording itself. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss, like background noise being amplified now that nothing else is competing with it. The sound is subtle, but once I notice it, I can't unhear it. It reminds me of breathing, but mechanical, measured, consistent. I stare at the screen. The waveform is flat, no spikes, no movement. just a thin, steady line. The recording is still capturing something. And that's when I realize the most unsettling part of all of this. The silence isn't empty. It's full of listening. I don't say anything else. I don't end the recording right away either. I just sit there, surrounded by the absence of sound understanding. Too late what the final lesson has been this whole time. When everything goes quiet, you don't disappear. You become easier to hear. I don't know how long I sat there after everything went quiet. Time had stopped behaving normally. Without the usual sounds to mark its passing, the AC cycling, the refrigerator, humming the distant traffic, minutes felt like something theoretical. My body stayed perfectly still, not because I thought movement would make a difference, but because stillness felt like the only honest response to what the room had become. I was listening, not actively, not urgently, just existing in a state of attention so complete it bordered on numbness. The kind of listening where you're no longer separating sounds into categories, safe, unsafe, familiar, unfamiliar, but absorbing the space as a whole, waiting for it to change shape. The silence held. My eyes burned from not blinking. My jaw ached from being clenched. Somewhere in my chest, my heartbeat continued slower, now heavier, like it was trying not to announce itself. I focused on that rhythm, counting it, using it as proof that I was still here. Then very gently, the room shifted. It wasn't a sound at first. It was pressure. A subtle change in the way the air felt against my skin, like the moment before a storm, when the atmosphere thickens and you know something is about to break. My scalp prickled. The hair on my arms lifted. I didn't turn my head. I didn't look at the window. I already knew where the sound would come from. It arrived softly, almost politely, as if not wanting to startle me. A whistle, one note, thin, controlled, held just long enough to be unmistakable, then released back into the night. Outside, my lungs locked up. I couldn't draw a breath for a second that felt impossibly long. The sound didn't repeat right away. It never did. It was never impatient. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed felt closer now, no longer neutral. It wrapped around the room, pressing in from the edges, making the walls feel less solid than they had a moment ago. I became acutely aware of the glass in the window, how thin it really was, how easily it separated inside from outside safety, from exposure. I thought about everything I hadn't said, all the details I'd left out because they felt too small, too subjective, too easy to dismiss. The way the whistle always sounded exactly the same no matter the distance, the way it never echoed, the way it didn't feel like a signal meant to locate someone, but like a marker, something placed deliberately in space. I wondered if this was how it ended. Not with noise, not with violence, not with anything that would make sense in a headline or a police report. Just a sound outside a window, late at night, and a person inside who understood too much to pretend it meant nothing. The whistle came again. Closer this time. Not louder, closer. The distinction mattered. Loudness could be distance closing. Closeness felt like intention. Like he had repositioned himself not to threaten, but to confirm that I was still paying attention. I didn't speak. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't move toward the door or the window or anywhere else. Because in that moment, I understood what he had been teaching me all along. Every night, every note, every quiet test of boundaries had been leading here. Not to fear, exactly, but to awareness. To the understanding that once you recognize a pattern like this, you can never truly go back to ignorance. You start listening differently. You start noticing things you used to ignore. You start questioning the quiet. The whistle faded again, leaving the night exactly as it had been, still silent, outwardly harmless. If someone had been watching from a distance, they would have seen nothing wrong. A dark building, a closed window, no movement, normal. I stayed where I was, eyes forward, breathing shallow, letting the silence settle back into place. The recording light was still on. I hadn't stopped it. I wasn't sure why. Maybe some part of me wanted proof that this moment had existed, or maybe I didn't want to be alone with it. I thought about you then, about the person listening to this now, about the way stories like this sink in slowly, how they don't scare you all at once but linger, how they follow you into the quiet parts of your day, into the moments when you're alone with familiar sounds and start wondering why they feel different. I wondered where you were when you heard the first whistle in this story. I wondered where you are now. Outside, something shifted. A faint movement, just enough to disturb the air. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear fabric brush against anything. I didn't hear breathing, just presence. The whistle didn't come again. That didn't make me feel better. It meant he had finished saying what he needed to say. I reached forward slowly and stopped the recording. The click of the button sounded impossibly loud in the silence, like I'd just slammed a door in an empty house. The screen went dark. The room stayed the same. For a long time, I didn't move. And before I finally stood up, before I did anything else, I had one last thought, sharp and unwelcome, settle into place. He never needed me to answer. He only needed me to listen. So if you're hearing this, check your window. What makes this story truly disturbing isn't the presence of a stranger, a whistle in the dark, or even the idea of being watched. It's the realization that nothing obviously wrong had to happen for fear to take hold. There was no explosion of violence, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where the danger announced itself clearly enough to be named and resolved. Instead, the threat lived in patience, in silence, in the slow understanding that attention, quiet, deliberate attention, can be more unsettling than force. At its core, this story isn't about a man outside a house. It's about vulnerability in ordinary life. Most of us believe danger looks dramatic. Loud footsteps, broken glass, raised voices. But this story challenges that belief. It reminds us that real fear often arrives quietly disguised as coincidence, or something probably nothing. And by the time we accept that something is wrong, the discomfort has already settled deep into our routines. What's especially powerful is that the narrator doesn't make reckless choices. He's cautious, thoughtful, rational. In many ways, he behaves exactly the way we're taught to behave. Don't overreact, don't cause a scene, don't assume the worst. And yet those very instincts become the cracks through which fear enters. This isn't a story about weakness. It's a story about predictability. The most unsettling idea is that the threat isn't random. It isn't chaotic. It's selective. It observes. It learns. It waits. Not because it has to, but because it can. That's a chilling reminder that danger doesn't always come from aggression. Sometimes it comes from patience. And still, there is something quietly hopeful here. The act of telling this story is itself a form of resistance. By speaking, the narrator breaks the pattern of silence that allowed the situation to grow. By sharing, he refuses to let fear remain private, contained, and isolating. The story becomes less about being hunted and more about awareness, about reclaiming attention instead of surrendering it. This isn't meant to make us paranoid. It's meant to make us present. It encourages us to trust our instincts without letting fear rule us, to notice patterns without obsessing over them, to take discomfort seriously without assuming the worst. And most importantly, it reminds us that staying silent isn't always the same as staying safe. In the end, the coldest truth of the story isn't that someone was watching. It's that the narrator was forced to truly see his own life, his habits, his assumptions, his responses in a way most of us never do. And while that awareness is frightening, it's also empowering. Because once you notice a pattern, you have the chance to change it. Fear thrives in quiet corners of uncertainty. Awareness brings light not to everything, but enough to move forward.